Good morning, everybody. I call this hearing to order, and we're going to get started as soon as we have everybody set. And today's hearing focuses on the Trump administration's policy priorities under the Clean Water Act and the impacts on our communities. Let me begin by asking unanimous consent that committee members not on the subcommittee be permitted to sit with the subcommittee at today's hearing and allowed to ask questions. Without objection, so ordered. I also ask unanimous consent that the chair be authorized to declare recess during today's hearing. Without objection, so ordered. Today's hearing has been a long time in coming and is long overdue. This is our first opportunity in 3 years to question this administration on its vision of the Clean Water Act and whether their vision is consistent with the law and in line with the wishes of the American people. We have much to discuss. In the past 3 years, this administration has taken unprecedented steps to critically weaken our Clean Water Act, one of our nation's most important environmental laws for protecting our health and the health of our environment. In just 3 short years, EPA has repealed efforts to restore longstanding protections for rivers, streams, wetlands that provide drinking water to over 117 million Americans. In just 3 years, EPA has proposed to eliminate Reagan-Era protections on an estimated 50 million acres of wetlands, 2 million miles of rivers and streams, and over more than half of the remaining wetlands and stream miles in the entire country. In just 3 years, EPA has ground Clean Water Act enforcement to a standstill, imposing political influences on decisions when or if to enforce the law, and rely on unproven and unquantifiable so-called compliance initiatives to make it sound like the agency is doing something. In just 3 years, EPA has attached foundational underpinnings of the 1972 Clean Water Act, including the longstanding federal-state partnership in co-administering the law, the backstop EPA veto authority, which ensures that projects with unacceptable impact to the environment cannot move forward, and the authority to prevent pollution from existing point sources. Finally, in just 3 short years, this administration has actively tried to eviscerate, undermine, and silence the scientific and technical expertise and effectiveness of the agency, clearly demonstrating that this administration's fear of science and its view that a weakened, underfunded, and understaffed agency is a compliant agency. As noted in the recent testimony of former Republican EPA Administrator Christy Todd Whitman, she stated, "Today, as never before, the mission of EPA is being seriously undermined by the very people who have been entrusted with carrying that mission out." The Trump administration has explicitly sought to reorient EPA towards industrial and industry-friendly interests, often with little or no acknowledgement of the agency health and environment missions. Mr. Ross, Administrator Ross, I'm glad you accepted our invitation to testify this morning, and I appreciate your being here. However, excuse me. Excuse me. However, as you can surmise, members on both sides of the aisle are frustrated by the seemingly disconnect between your actions and the missions of EPA. I can only imagine how much polluters love what you're doing. However, when 63% of Americans tell us that they're a great deal worried about pollution in drinking water, when 57% of American people worry a great deal about pollution in their rivers, lakes, reservoirs, and when hardworking Americans and communities of color say that they are more concerned about water pollution than any other time in recent history, something is clearly wrong. Today, your job is to answer this subcommittee and the American people why you think a weakened Clean Water Act is in the best interest of hardworking American families. Please don't fall back to the tired false choice of economy versus the environment. We can easily point to you both the Clinton and Obama administration where the economy was strong, as was our Clean Water Act protections. We will continue to protect EPA's stated mission. In this time, I'm pleased to yield to my colleague, the ranking member of our subcommittee, Mr. Westonbirt, for any thoughts he may have.
Thank you, Chairwoman Napolitano, for holding this hearing and thank you to our witnesses for being here to discuss EPA's initiatives under the Clean Water Act. In particular, I would like to acknowledge Assistant Administrator Dave Roth from EPA's Office of Water for taking the time to be here. And on the second panel, I'm glad to be able to welcome Becky Keough, who's the Secretary of Energy and Environment from my home state of Arkansas. Water is obviously critical for life. We can't live without it, and I can't stress enough the importance of protecting our nation's water supply and quality, and how water policy shouldn't be about politics, but about applying the best science with the most common sense approach. Living in rural Arkansas or living anywhere in this country, you know that we all rely on clean water for drinking, for our homes, for our businesses and farms. And we also rely on effective wastewater management and irrigation to preserve the livelihoods of many people who produce the food that feeds our country. Protecting our waters is absolutely critical to communities and ecosystems at home and all around the nation. We have made substantial progress over the past 4.5 decades improving water quality in our nation, but I also understand that some challenging issues still remain. The most effective way to address these issues is through implementing effective and pragmatic environmental policies under the Clean Water Act that balance environmental, economic, and social outcomes. States need to be empowered and engaged as equal partners with the federal government in working to achieve these objectives. Neither the federal government nor a state should become overbearing and upset that balance. Maintaining the balanced federal-state partnership that Congress originally intended under the Clean Water Act is fundamental to achieving the objectives of the Act. This is cooperative federalism. It is critical that neither the federal government nor a state takes too heavy-handed approach. We can and must protect and restore America's waters and wetlands with effective and pragmatic policy and regulation that provides regulatory certainty and is devoid of armies of consultants and lawyers. Legal and policy decisions must be informed by good science, be clear and concise, and preserve states' traditional authorities. I look forward to hearing testimony today from the EPA and stakeholders on how we can strike a balance between regulatory clarity and the need for robust environmental protection of waters and wetlands, and also maintain the federal-state partnership that was envisioned under the Clean Water Act. And Madam Chairwoman, I ask unanimous consent that the written testimony be submitted on behalf of the following: the U.S. Chamber of Commerce and the Chamber's Business Task Force on Water Policy Principles, and the National Association of Homebuilders, and the American Forest and Paper Association.
Ordered.
And with that, I yield back.
Thank you very much. We now have the chair of the full committee, Mr. DeFazio.
Thanks, Madam Chair. Long before I was in Congress, 1972, an overwhelming bipartisan majority and President Nixon agreed that the fact that Lake Erie was declared dead, the Cuyahoga River caught fire, and in my state, the Willamette River was an open sewer that we needed to do something about it. So, hence the Clean Water Act. We're now at a point where we're facing 21st century challenges to our clean water and also new challenges in terms of climate change and severe climate events. So, what was the reaction of this administration? Well, they're leading a campaign to dismantle the Clean Water Act. Historic, I guess, being pushed by the mining industry, oil and gas, small and large industrial polluters. They want to go back to pre-1986 Reagan-era rules. They want to roll back the scope of the waters that are covered. That would strip clean water protections for over 60% of stream miles and close to half of our remaining acres of wetlands. In the West, it would remove, they take out, and they've asked, should we remove all protections for intermittent and ephemeral streams? They're already proposing significant cutbacks, but, well, let's get rid of all of those things. Well, that would be 74% of the stream miles in my state of Oregon, would be unprotected, 87% in the state of California, 99% in the state of Arizona, 97% in the state of New Mexico, 96% in the state of Nevada, and a nationwide impact elsewhere. But I don't have time to go through every state and the impact, but every state, all Americans would be impacted by this proposal. In fact, look at this handy chart provided by this administration. These are the predicted impacts of their rule. Oh, minimal kind of stuff. Let's just go to down. Let's forget about the environment in the section in the middle. Let's just go to economic impacts. 404 permits and mitigation. Reduced ecosystem values, i.e. recreation, hunting, fishing, would be severely damaged. Oh, how about this one? Downstream inundation damages. Think of the broke federal flood insurance program, already in huge deficit, and the challenges that FEMA has. But hey, we're gonna make it worse. Don't worry about it. And then, we could just say, look over here, under the 402 permits, greater drinking water treatment and dredging costs. Well, the states will do it. The states will do it. The states will clean up the water that came across the border from another state that's doing nothing about the filth going into it, and they'll pay for it. Not the feds, and we're not going to make that other state clean it up. No. They can dump whatever they want in because it's an economic value to them, and it just flows over the border to another state. That state will just have to, if their people want to drink it, that's their problem. This is unbelievable. You know, I sat in this committee back during the Gingrich era, and we had a markup that went on for a week. It was embarrassing, and it was essentially what you people are proposing. That was Bud Schuster's darkest moment. And that bill was so embarrassing and so bad, that dirty water bill, that Newt Gingrich wouldn't even bring it to the floor. But you people have the gall to try and do all this stuff administratively and dismantle more than half a century of progress. I mean, this is unbelievable. I mean, I can go on and on about this. But, you know, rivers flow across borders, groundwater migrates all everywhere. And, states will take care of it. Well, the states are, pretty pressed. And, we used to help build wastewater systems. I was a county commissioner. We got an 80% federal match. You know what the match is today? Zero. And in fact, Trump has proposed to cut the very minimal amount of money that we use to assist the states in drinking with wastewater. And those systems are wearing out. The EPA itself says we need $270 billion in the next 20 years. And that doesn't even include new expenditures for resilience and climate change. I have areas where, these systems go underwater now regularly. We have to take care of those things. But what's the federal government going to do? Well, the Trump administration is going to cut federal partnership down to virtually nothing for everybody. And then there's been this horrible tragedy that happened in the Southeast. And the committee held hearings at the time, then we lost the House and Congress didn't do anything about it that was meaningful. But, exposure to toxic pollutants. The first update to power plant regulations since 1982 came out of President Obama. We held hearings on the TVA Kingston fossil plant coal ash pond disaster in 2008. We couldn't get anything out of a Republican Congress. The Obama administration took action. What's this administration going to do? They are going to undo that. Don't worry, you'll get your daily dose of, selenium, cadmium, arsenic, and all those things under their proposed rule. We'll do nothing about the coal ash. The Obama rule has reduced the amount by 1.4 billion pounds, 90%. They're going to put that 1.4 billion pounds or allow that to go back in. And your own analysis says that this Obama rule had minimal impacts on electricity prices and the amount of electric generating capacity, but no, we're going to do away with the rule because somebody wanted it. Coal industry, I don't know. I'm not sure who. Now, I don't know. Are you using new science? No, I don't think so. This is all very political, and it is very short-sighted. We're no longer doing enforcement. We have a new rule. You find someone violating the Clean Water Act. First off, we're not not really not allowing the people to go out and do inspections anymore, but you find someone in violation and you recommend that there should be penalties, it has to be approved by a political appointee, not a scientist, not a career person, a political appointee. You know what the answer is going to be? Hell no. We don't enforce that law. We're not going to make those polluters pay a fine. This is outrageous. And Madam Chair, I regret that I won't be able to stay for the entire hearing because I have two other major things this morning, but I will be around long enough to at least engage in one round of questions, and I may use an extended period of time, and I will grant the same amount to the minority for them if they want to apologize for his actions. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. DeFazio. Now tell us how you really feel. I love it. Without objection, I ask unanimous consent to insert the following letters and documents into the record, along with the ones that are given by the minority. A series of oversight letters from this committee to EPA, some of the responses we've received thus far. Other correspondence the committee has received relative to the issue to be discussed today. Map of the PFAS pollution, and a letter from the Attorney General's requesting congressional action on PFAS. Without objection, so ordered. Now we will proceed to hear from our witness who will testify, and I thank you for being here. You're in the hot seat, Mr. Roth, but I thank you anyway. You're welcome to the hearing, and your prepared statement will be entered in the record, and all witnesses are asked to limit their remarks to 5 minutes. The Honorable David Ross, Assistant Administrator, Office of Water, U.S. EPA. You're on.
Well, good morning, Chairwoman Napolitano, Ranking Member Westerman, Chairman DeFazio, and members of the subcommittee. I'm Dave Ross, EPA's Assistant Administrator for the Office of Water. It is a pleasure to be here today. I want to begin by thanking the dedicated professionals working within the Office of Water for their service to this country and for their passion in delivering on the agency's core mission of protecting public health and the environment. The Office of Water has an extensive portfolio of responsibility, but I would like to begin today by highlighting a few priority areas for the subcommittee, including modernizing and rebuilding America's water infrastructure, encouraging the adoption of water reuse, and ensuring a sustainable workforce in the water sector. My written testimony provides a more in-depth discussion of some other additional topics. One of the highest priorities for the Office of Water is to ensure that the agency implements our appropriated grant and loan programs as expeditiously and transparently as possible. It is our job to put our hard-earned taxpayer resources to work as quickly as possible. One program that I would like to highlight in particular is the Water Infrastructure Finance and Innovation Act program, or WIFIA for short. The WIFIA program is complex and it took some time to set up, but is now operating at full capacity and is producing tremendous results. In the past year, EPA has announced 11 WIFIA loans leveraging approximately $3 billion in taxpayer resources to help finance over $6.5 billion in water infrastructure projects, and we anticipate announcing several more loans in the very near future. In fact, with existing appropriations, the WIFIA program is slated to leverage approximately $10 billion in credit assistance to finance over $20 billion in water infrastructure investments while creating thousands of jobs in communities throughout the country. Another priority for the Office of Water is promoting the reuse of water for beneficial purposes instead of treating it as waste. 40 of our state partners anticipate some freshwater shortages in the next decade, and all levels of government have a responsibility to ensure that Americans have access to reliable sources of clean and safe water. That is why last week at the Water Reuse Symposium in San Diego, EPA and our federal partners released a draft National Water Use Action Plan for public review and comment. There's innovative work happening throughout the water sector to advance water reuse, and the action plan is intended to help facilitate adoption of water reuse to support improved water resiliency, sustainability, and security. To protect our nation's investments in aging infrastructure and capacity development, we must not forget about our human capital needs. Without a capable, knowledgeable, and diverse workforce of water professionals, our financial investments will be put at risk. The water sector workforce is underappreciated. I began my career working alongside wastewater treatment operators in Southern California, and looking back now, I realize how valuable they were to my education and professional development. They are the true environmental heroes, protecting public health and the environment every day, and they deserve the same recognition in society as our emergency responders, teachers, and public health professionals. We know that more than 1/3 of our water and wastewater operators will be eligible to retire in the next 10 years, and technology is outpacing training. While this is primarily a state and local issue, I see an important role for federal leadership. That's why EPA is working with our federal partners to support water workforce training and development. For example, we are working with the Veterans Administration to provide information on water careers to disabled veterans and are exploring other collaborative opportunities with our military services. The country relies on this workforce every day, and it is imperative that we focus resources on supporting this critical sector. Finally, I want to conclude by describing my touchstone for addressing many of the complex regulatory questions facing the Office of Water. Determining first what the law is, not what we want it to be. Under our system of laws, an executive branch agency can only exercise the power that Congress delegates to it. The federal government has a poor track record in Supreme Court cases involving the Clean Water Act in which it was a party. For example, in the last 3 major cases, Sackett, Hawks, and NAM, federal positions failed to secure a single vote from any Supreme Court justice. That's almost impossible to do. That is why, under this administration, the Office of Water is focused on restoring the rule of law and providing regulatory certainty by starting with a robust analysis of our base legal authorities before deciding our policy positions. Members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to testify today. I look forward to answering any questions you may have.
Thank you for your testimony, and we'll start with the questions with the panel. Chairman DeFazio, you're up first.
Thank you, Madam Chair, for letting me go out of order because of my schedule constraints. Administrator Ross, in your testimony, you say that we're going to go back to those that existed immediately prior to the 2015 rule. So I assume that means the regulatory definitions from '86?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay. Are you familiar with all the criticism of a number of the groups that are supporting some of what you're doing of the rules in 1986, the arbitrary and inexact nature of those rules, which subsequent administrations, Bush administration, Obama administration, tried to fix? So we're just going to go back to this very confusing time and end up with that as a directive?
Well, right now, our direction is to restore the rule of law, and the Obama 2015 rule, one, never went into effect in significant portions of this country. Several courts shut it down because the merits arguments that
Okay, but are you going to try and write an interpretation? Because as of, back at that time, 1986, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, the farmers, everybody's saying, hey, this is horrible. This is unenforceable, it's arbitrary, it's capricious, it's different everywhere. So the Bush administration tried, okay? Then the Obama administration tried. And now you're going to say, no, we're not going to do what the Obama administration did. We're just going to go back to 1986. Is that it? Or are you writing a new rule?
Well, we're doing both. One, we're responding to 2 courts that have remanded the 2015 rule back to the agency as unlawful. Mm-hmm. At the same time, we're restoring the existing, and one court said the imperfect but familiar 86, okay. 87 regime, and we are redrafting and proposing a new definition.
You're out asking for comment. Now, your initial proposal says that ephemeral streams are out. So what percent is that of what's covered today? Do you know?
Actually, we don't. We do not have maps that actually
identify. I think those maps do exist. The previous administration substantiated them. Scientists substantiated them. That's 18%. Let's try another one. Clean Water Act protections for intermittent streams, which are 52% of the nation's streams. How many miles of intermittent streams would lose federal protection? And are you asking the opinion that we should take all intermittent streams out? And I already told you the impact in a number of western states.
2 things. The last administration actually had the administrator, the deputy administrator, and the assistant administrator of water testify and send letters to Congress saying that we do not have maps that show the Clean Water Act jurisdiction. I agree with them. As far as what our proposal is, right now we have drawn the line at ephemerals. Intermittents are categorically in, as opposed to the 86 and the 88 regime, where they're in if they satisfy the significant nexus.
Well, actually, they did. The Obama administration did do an analysis. There were metrics. We have a document from 2015. but either you can't access the data, or maybe that's part of what got wiped out by this administration in trying to undo science. I don't know. All right, let's try one more. So let's go to wetlands. A lot of people care about wetlands, you know, including hunters, fishers, recreationists, everybody. So what percent of our wetlands would be eliminated from Clean Water Act protections under your proposal?
Actually, we also do not know that as well, because the
So,
prior
okay, wait a
ministry-
minute, wait a minute. So you're proposing to undo protections on intermittent streams, ephemeral streams, and wetlands, and you don't know what the impact of what you're proposing would be. That's great.
We actually
So
are
is
not
it
proposing.
50%? That's the estimates we see, but you're saying you don't know. So, okay, all right, let's move on. So how about the economic impacts? If I could have the chart back up, that's your own chart there. We talk about, downstream inundation damages, flood insurance. What about that? Greater drinking water treatment and dredging costs. These are desirable outcomes? This is like, seriously? Who's going to pay for that stuff?
So in our economic analysis, we did qualitatively discuss if there would be reduced federal jurisdiction.
Qualitative, not quantitative?
Because we do not have the data, and we
Okay,
agree
so you
with
don't
the
have
prior
any
administration,
data.
we don't have
So
the data.
maybe before you propose anything, you should go out and get some damn data?
That's exactly what I'm trying to do. The last administration and the prior administrations failed to develop maps of waters in the United States in this country. In our proposal, if you take a look at
Okay,
we
let's try
actually
an
asked,
easy
we're
one. This
working
is
on
an easy
developing
one.
maps,
This
and
is
I'm
an
trying to
easy
solve
one
that gap.
because this comes from the Bush era, Republicans. In 2007, EPA estimated 16,000 existing permitted facilities were located on intermittent, ephemeral, or headwater streams. So if those streams, some percentage of them, you don't know what, are taken out by your new rule, what happens to those permits?
Well, it depends. If they still satisfy the definition of point source and conveyance, they still are regulated under the Clean Water Act.
But you're saying some percent, 8,000, 10,000, 12,000 polluters would no longer be regulated because those permits would just go away because you deem that an intermittent or an ephemeral stream is never going to put that crap into a permanent stream.
One, we're not proposing to reduce jurisdiction over intermittent. And two, if they still satisfy the definition of point source, they will be regulated. And three, the states have robust environmental programs under state law.
No, many states, in fact, can't exceed federal Clean Water Act requirements. So if you deregulate someone and they no longer are regulated by the feds, many states have laws saying they can't regulate them. They would have to go out and pass a new law, and then they would have to set up a new regulatory system with constrained resources, something that the federal government has been doing very well. But we're going to abandon that practice. For what reason?
Because of the rule of law. The last administration
rule of law. Well,
proposed a rule that courts have already struck down.
okay, let's go to one last one. I talked about the TVA spill. Horrible, horrible disaster. And later, a bunch of workers died who were cleaning it up, let alone the permanent damage to the environment, the people who lived adjacent to it, all that. And you are going to reverse those efforts that will allow up to 90% more pollution by these persistent toxic materials. Why is that? It has a tiny incremental cost, well, of course, you probably don't have that data, on the cost of energy generation or availability. But hey, it might be $1 per kilowatt hour. So what if we inundate thousands of acres with toxic materials, kill some more people, whatever?
So the administration is taking a look at the coal combustion rule, which is actually a different program office than mine, so I'm not working that particular rule. But I understand
Okay, but I'm
proposals
sure
are-
they're going to follow the rule of law. Thank you very much. I'm just pleased you're here today. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Mr. DeFazio. Mr. Westerman.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Roth, I'm the ranking member on the committee, but I'm also a licensed professional engineer. I spent over 2 decades doing engineering work, and I've actually worked on MPDS permits, on stormwater discharge permits. I've been on the other side of it and seen the regulations that come down from the federal government, and also have worked with people who have probably forgot more about permitting and what you have to do to actually meet the requirements of permitting than the collective knowledge of this committee. It's a lot different when you're in the real world dealing with what comes down from Washington, D.C. And I'm curious, and the chairman has stepped out, but these maps and information he's talking about, I can tell you a lot of engineers that would really like to see those maps and information if they're out there. Could you point us to where those maps are that the previous administration developed?
Well, the previous administration actually provided them to Congress, but did not include them in the docket for the 2015 rule because they determined that they were not representative of the jurisdictional waters of the Clean Water Act. They're effectively based on the National Hydrography Data Set that the USGS runs, and also the National Wetlands Inventory, which the Fish and Wildlife Service run. The National Hydrography Data Set, for example, cannot see and cannot tell the difference, even at high resolution, between intermittent and ephemerals in certain, other than in only certain portions of the country. And based on the data that you guys have been citing earlier today, the 117 million Americans was based on the National Hydrography Data Set at medium resolution, which means it can't see ephemerals. The National Wetlands Inventory has way more wetlands on it than jurisdictional wetlands because it was created for a different purpose. So those maps are available. They were submitted to Congress in the last administration, but they were not included in the rulemaking for the Obama rule because they're not representative. So my job is to try to close that gap. The last administration believed that we did not have the ability to map this. I disagree, and so we're working with our federal partners to try to map this so that 5-10 years in the future, people will be able to stand on the landscape and identify a federal versus a state water. I believe we have the skills to do it. It's just gonna take us the time to do it.
And it sounds to me like you're actually trying to apply science, trying to use the best mapping technology to come up with something so that people who are out there trying to deal with these regulations actually have something that they can use to meet the requirements. If you don't know what the requirement is, it's hard to meet the requirement. I have a picture. I'm not sure if it's up on the, going to be able to be put up on the screen, but it's a 4-acre pond that a constituent of mine sent in a development in Texarkana, Arkansas, that they went through every permitting regulation, jumped through every hoop and hurdle. They built the pond for retention water. It did a remarkable job of improving the environment in this area. But now the Corps of Engineers has come back. Here's a picture of the pond, and told them that they either have to pay $340,000 of mitigation credits or remove this dam. That's not something they knew on the front end. So I applaud the administration for trying to put some sanity into these regulations so that people know how to deal with them. How will the new WOTUS definition provide some clarity and end years of uncertainty over where federal jurisdiction begins and ends?
Well, first and foremost, we started with the touchdown. We took a look at the case law, the Supreme Court guidance, to try to figure out where would the scope of our authority began and ends. And so with that, my job is to protect the Clean Water Act. And if we continue to drop regulations that push the constitutional envelope of our authority, at some point a court is going to declare the definition of waters in the United States incapable of definition. That will actually create significant tension for the long-term legality of the Clean Water Act. So my goal is to defend the Clean Water Act, and we're doing that by staying within the bounds of our legal authority, and then regulating the known waters, the traditional navigable waters, the perennial waters. We've actually proposed to include intermittent waters, and then the adjacent wetlands that we know connect on a regular basis to all of those waters. The goal is certainty, predictability, clarity. It's out for comment. We've gotten 600,000 comments. We're taking our time to analyze that, and we'll move forward with finalizing it as soon as we possibly can.
And the chairman also suggested that we take more time so that we could apologize. I would like to take some time and apologize to all those farmers, those construction workers, everybody that's out there in this country trying to do the right thing to make the economy better, to protect our water quality. They don't want to sidestep the rules or avoid the rules. They want to know what the rules are so that they can meet the regulations, so that they can carry on with their business, and so that they can provide all the needs that they provide for this country. So I will take a moment and apologize for the ineptitude of the federal government to give them the tools that they need to do their job. That's what most people want to do. They don't want to destroy the environment. They don't want to pollute streams, just like this pond up here. That pond provides erosion control, improves water quality, but because of some regulation that somebody felt like on one certain day, now they're saying you've got to go in and tear it out at a huge cost or buy mitigation credits. There's no common sense in what's going on in many of these rules that are getting passed down. So again, I applaud the administration for trying to put some common sense into the policy, to find out what the science is, to provide the maps, to provide the delineations, so that people can do the work that they're trying to do every day. Section 101B of the Clean Water Act states that it is the policy of the Congress to recognize, preserve, and protect the primary responsibilities and rights of states to prevent, reduce, and eliminate pollution, to plan the development and use, including restoration, preservation, and enhancement of land and water resources, and to consult with the administrator in the exercise of his authority under this chapter. Wouldn't you agree that it was the intent of Congress, through these words, to recognize the primacy of states in protecting their own waters over that of the federal government?
I agree. I think that has been lost in the federal government in the past several decades.
Do you think the states understand the water issues in their areas better than the federal government can understand those issues from afar?
I've had the honor of working for two different states and two different parts of the country, very dry in Wyoming, wet in Wisconsin. When I left this city and went to work for the states, I had a misinformation and misbelief that people in DC knew the resources best in the landscape. I was wildly wrong. It wasn't until I went and worked for the states that I recognized that they know their resources best. They know how to manage the resources best. Our job is to make sure that they're given the resources and the ability to manage their own resources and work in collaboration with the federal government. I didn't know that before I went and worked for the states.
Thank you. I yield back.
Okay, Assistant Administrator, as a follow-up to your statement, if I take your statement on the need for additional maps on the status of streams and wetlands at face value, then why would you propose to move forward on a proposal to change that jurisdiction before you have that data?
Well, we're moving forward, one, because the 2015 rule has been ruled and sent back to the agency as illegal. The second is we're restoring the familiar framework that folks have been operating since the mid-'80s. But we are moving forward with a new proposal because it's time to end the uncertainty and the confusion that the ranking member mentioned, that the farmers, developers, the regulated community struggles with a confusing definition, and every time a court issues a different decision, jurisdiction changes. It's time for us to do our job and provide a clear definition of waters in the United States that will withstand judicial scrutiny.
I hope you do so with the input from the people involved. That will begin the questionings, and thank you for your questions, your answer to the questions. We have a timer to allow 5 minutes for each question from each member. If there are additional questions, we will have a second round or more as necessary. Pardon me. As my district, the Department of Defense left behind a legacy of contamination that has threatened the health of my constituents for many years. Today, communities across the country are facing the same concerns with the PFAS pollution. EPA's PFAS Action Plan recognizes the adverse health effects from exposure to this legacy contaminant. On the next panel, we'll hear from a witness who has been personally impacted by the PFAS contamination in his community. Do you think PFAS pollution poses a risk to human health? Yes or no?
Yes, where we have exposure and we know the toxicological profile of the chemicals, yes, there are communities that are impacted by PFAS pollution.
Do you agree that a multifaceted effort to reduce additional releases of PFAS chemicals and cleanup of those already in the environment are necessary to limit the exposure to these pollutants?
Yeah, that is in fact the touchstone of our national action plan is to take a holistic view of all the
But how long will it take? We are in a crisis.
Well, we're actually moving quickly on, one, it's the first action plan across multimedia offices that the agency has ever developed, and it's a holistic approach that grapples with both the chemical entry into the market, the cleanup, the liability associated with it, the water quality standards, the science.
Have you
science
done the
needs to close
standards
gap.
yet? Pardon me, have you done standardizing yet?
Well, we have, in the PFAS action plan, we committed to developing a certain set of rules, and for example, in the Safe Drinking Water Act, we are moving forward with a regulatory determination process for PFOA and PFAS, PFOA, PFOS, it's hard to say those. And so we committed to getting that done by the end of the year, and we're still on schedule.
Before the end of the year, I hope to receive some information on that, sir. It's very important. I'd like to jump to your letter dated September the 16th about EPA's draft National Water Reuse Action Plan released on September the 10th. And we've discussed that. I'm passionate about water reuse and innovative technologies so that the communities can reuse the water, they clean it up, especially in places like California where resources can't be scant. And I appreciate your agency is doing to move the ball forward. But can you describe your administration's water reuse action plan seeks to discourage it seeks to discourage the development and implementation of new technologies and practices to promote water reuse? And how are you working with other federal agencies such as the Bureau of Reclamation, who has a long history of water recycling with their Title 16 program, the water recycling program?
Well, I want to thank you for your interest and your leadership on water reuse. Very rarely do federal governments and state and local governments think holistically about what we're going to need 10, 15, 20 years from now. We usually react to crises. The National Water Use Action Plan is designed to make sure that we have a sustainable source of new supply of water 5, 10, 15, 20 years from now, rather than reacting to a significant drought, for example. We are working in collaboration with our federal government. In fact, when I announced the National Use Action Plan, the Bureau of Reclamation Commissioner was with me, Department of Interior was with me, the Department of Energy, Council of Environmental Quality, Department of Agriculture. It was a broad effort across our federal family to work with our stakeholder engagement, and so the federal family is fully invested in this effort.
Would this committee be able to find out what the outcome of that collaboration is?
Absolutely. I think we sent you the draft action plan. I encourage you to read it. I think our team did a fantastic job with it. Our next 90 days, it's a public comment period, but we're really hoping it to be a public commitment period. There are 46 actions identified in the action plan under 10 strategic objectives, and we're looking for partners to champion each one of those action items, both from accountability standpoint, identify themselves and put themselves on a shot clock. Our federal partners will be committing to doing several actions in the action plan.
What can Congress do to further promote water?
Well, there's a lot that Congress can do. One, obviously, you have the power of the purse. And I've actually leveraged the Whiffy loan program and identified water reuse as one of our national strategies, and I'm thankful that in the last year we actually did receive several applications that will incentivize water reuse in large areas. But it's also helping provide resources to rural America, where large communities have the resource and the tax base to go after ratepayer. Small rural America struggles with water resources. And I think Congress needs to spend some attention thinking about rural America.
Thank you very much. I now recognize Mr. Bost.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. First off, let me start off, Mr. Ross, by saying that I don't think there's anybody on this dais or in this Congress that wants to ruin water for our children and our grandchildren. I think what you do is good, but I think whenever you made the statement, what you wanted to do was follow the law that is produced by Congress and implement it correctly with the best science possible, and that's what we want to see. That being said, in drafting regulation, the agency estimates avoiding costs of up to $340 million. You know, I've met with several stakeholders in my district about the 2015 water rule. The most common concern expressed was the haphazard way the rule was applied and potentially direct cost associated with permitting. And it didn't matter whether it was farmers or it was other businesses, but the other concerns are impact the rule has on the economic activity and investments overall. In my district, aggregate providers indicated that in addition to their own direct costs, the rule was suppressing building and investment by their own customers. shouldn't the agency require to conduct more rigorous economic analysis of their proposed rules to include impacts on jobs and the economy overall?
Well, yeah, the answer is yes. Under the Executive Order 12866, we actually do take a look at the broad economic consequences of our proposed rule. And so in our Step 2 proposal, for example, we did go after, to the best we could, because of some of the questions we were talking about earlier, we lack sort of the mapping capability to watch changes in jurisdiction. But we do take into account economic impact into our rulemakings, and we have a several hundred-page economic analysis that gets into that that we can share with the subcommittee.
Okay, and those are the important things that we need to know as we move forward. But let me tell you that as a member that spent 20 years in the state legislature as well, and watching the states try to implement their own rules, actually having to get a discharge permit, they said just for recording purposes, but then later came back and putting on businesses that could not afford it $5,000 and $10,000 discharge charges through the state. Every time we turn around, whether it's a small business, a medium business, a large business, whether it's agriculture, whether it's aggregate, or whatever the business might be, the problem is they never really know what's expected of them, and we keep moving the goalpost every time we turn around. Now, I said from the start that the concerns that I have is that I want clean water for my children and grandchildren. That being said, your job is to do what you brought up earlier while you were trying to explain, and that was it's the rule of law created by us, not by you. I think that the previous administration tried to go above and beyond that, and not the rule of law, but the rule of administrative rule, to try to implement their own ideas without coming through Congress. If a member of Congress has a problem with what you're doing, and you can, and they can say that, well, they're following the law, and they're not happy with the level of that law, then we need to get that done, not you. I am very impressed with your ideas of what you're proposing to do and how you're moving forward, and the idea of allowing people who are making investments in this nation, whether it's a farmer or whether it is a customer that produces, or a company that produces widgets, whatever that widget may be, that they at least know the rules of the game as they go in and know that the goalpost can't keep getting moved. And that was the problem with this rule, and it has been for many years, because it got to the point that we were feeling like, the general public was feeling like, that the EPA wanted to control the drops of water running off my cap when it rained. I believe that it is very clear what the law is, and I think you're doing a fine job, and thank you for your time. And with that, I yield back.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Bost. Ms. Mercasile-Power, I'm sorry? Okay, thank you. Ms. Mercasile-Power, you have the floor.
Thank you. Good morning, Mr. Ross. I represent the southernmost district in the state of Florida, Florida Keys. The Everglades is a huge part of my district. And as you probably know, the Everglades are crucial for all of Florida. The health of the Everglades is essential for our economy, for our health, and for our wildlife. The Everglades also naturally filters out toxins and harmful nutrients like phosphorus. Higher levels of these pollutants lead to toxic algal blooms, countless dead fish, and red tides. The Everglades, clean water from the Everglades also provides clean drinking water for more than 8 million Floridians alone. Now, the Florida delegation has been working closely together on a bipartisan basis to push forward Everglades restoration. We recognize the importance of these wetlands, and it seems that now the administration, after having adjusted its budget request for Everglades restoration to the full $200 million, which I requested, it's beginning to recognize their importance too. But what's very difficult to understand is that the administration's actions are in conflict with each other. On the one hand, it says that it wants to fund Everglades restoration, and then on the other hand, it's working to rewrite regulations to make those protections even weaker for our water in Florida. So either the Trump administration and the EPA care about Florida or they don't. So under your position, and I quote this, under cooperative federalism, those waters not covered by the Federal Clean Water Act would be addressed by the individual states. We saw what happened back in 2016 under the previous governor, his administration. What they did was the Florida Department of Environmental Protection updated its regulations to permit more toxic chemicals to come into the water. And I have some images that I would like for you to take a look at. I don't know, have you seen the toxic algal blooms? This is 2 years after the governor actually eased the regulations permitting more toxic chemicals to be released into the water. And I heard you talking about economic impact. We had to close several businesses along both the east and the west coast of Florida. 15 people ended up in the emergency room. We saw images of thousands of dead fish, dead manatee, dead dolphins. We continue to work on this issue. So if I hear you correctly, you're saying that you want to leave it up to the states to regulate their own waters, right? Is that correct?
Actually, both federal and state regulation, depending on the
Both federal
wastewater.
and state. Can I ask you what you are currently doing? How are you working closely with the Army Corps into how you regulate those toxins that are coming into Lake Okeechobee that have caused these green-blue algal blooms to be released?
So we are working very closely with the Army Corps of Engineers. I've talked to Artie James and Mr. Fisher specifically about this, working in partnership. Our teams have been down actually touring Lake Okeechobee with no
When was
balancing.
that, Mr. Ross?
Earlier this year. I sent my principal deputy down to actually take a tour of Lake Okeechobee.
And have you formed a plan of action here?
We're actually working, well, there are a couple of things that we're doing. One, we're working with the state and working with the Corps to try to figure out the lake levels associated with, how do you actually grapple with the lake levels and discharges. There's a plan in place and working with the Department of Agriculture.
And what about regulating the pollutants that are coming into the lake?
Well, so some of that is non-point source pollution that's outside the scope of the Clean Water Act, but in that, I'm actually spending a lot of time and energy on excess nutrients in surface water. It's one of our, we have our regulatory tools and total maximum daily loads and all those enforcement tools, but we also need to do a better job tapping into our creative market-based mechanisms. And so over the course of this year, I've developed a policy to
If you
incentivize
could provide that
market-based
plan
mechanisms.
for me, I would really appreciate it. I'm almost out of time.
I'd be happy to.
One more question that I had for you. In South Florida, we have wet and dry season, as you're aware, and during some dry seasons, which of course fluctuate year by year, significant portions of the Everglades dry up. And I'm deeply concerned that the administration's actions will leave much of the Everglades without the Clean Water Act protections. Can you assure me today that, to me and my Florida colleagues, that any rule that the administration implements as it pertains to the Clean Water Act will ensure that the Everglades and its watershed will receive full Clean Water Act protections despite dry areas during dry seasons?
So my understanding is the Florida Everglades are the wetlands that would remain subject to our jurisdiction and our proposed rule.
So can you make that assurance to me today?
Well, holistically, it's a large landscape down there, and so if there are individual
So
pockets.
is that a no? You can't do that
It is a
today.
yes qualified by I can't speak to every single wetland down in Florida. But the other thing I want to mention is Florida has a really remarkable wetlands protection program, and so they
You
regulate
mean the
wetlands.
state, which,
the
I mean,
state
you
of
can
Florida
see,
has a
you
more.
can see what happens when we leave it up to the state. Now, so is the EPA under the Trump administration going to open up the Everglades for further development and pollution, if you're not willing to make that commitment to me today?
I have no plans to open up the Everglades for further development, but that really is a local and state issue.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Mercosur-Powell. Mr. Palmer, you have the floor.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. First of all, Mr. Ross, I want to go back to the question about mapping, and I'd like to know, is it possible to use maps for regulatory purposes?
So right now, the NAHD Plus and the National Wetlands Inventory are not used for regulatory purposes. And in fact, we can submit significant letters from the last administration saying that. In fact, EPA published a blog in 2014 saying they cannot be used for regulatory purposes now or ever. The last word I don't agree with. I actually think we can improve these maps and use them in the future, but we have work to do.
So you think you could use maps like the Natural Hydrographic Data Set and the National Wetlands Inventory, those type maps for regulatory purposes, or particularly for jurisdictional determinations?
We use them, the Army Corps of Engineers uses them a little bit as desktop tools as they go out into the field before they go do their field verification. So they're useful tools as desktop before they go out, but actually making decisions based on those maps, no, they are not designed to do that. And they have never been designed to do that.
Are they complete? Are these
Nope.
dated? They're not?
They're not complete. You know, the number one flaw on the National Hydrography data set is that they don't really see ephemerals. There are portions of the country, and the USGS, Dr. Riley and his team are actually working to improve the resolution to see additional water resources, but right now, they really struggle differentiating between ephemerals and intermittents.
Then it seems to me that we're the previous administration particularly, and maybe the administration before that, is making decisions on incomplete data sets.
Well, actually, the last administration decided not to use those maps as part of their rulemaking. They specifically did not use them and did not put them in the docket.
Okay, that's what troubles me, is we heard a very impassioned, you received some pretty impassioned questioning from the chairman. And I know people have great concerns. We've gone through water quality issues before. But it's, first of all, it's insulting to infer that anyone wants to have filthy water, that anyone wants to destroy the water for recreational use, much less drinking. And the thing that gets me is going back to the 2015 rule, when this first came about, is that it appeared to rely on data estimates that were really about supporting an environmental agenda. They didn't do original research. Is that what you found?
Well, and granted, I wasn't around, but that's why I said in my opening statement that my job is to begin with the law as it's written, not as what I want it to be. I believe the last administration was pursuing policy objectives before looking at the law.
And that's my point. The last administration transferred benefits from estimates that really didn't apply to the rule. And it became, I really think it became more about more government control than it was really finding solutions to the problems that we do have. And I worked for two international engineering companies, one of which was Environmental Systems. And I know we've got the technical ability to make dramatic improvement in water quality, air quality, land use, pretty much anything you want to do, but that has to be your primary objective. It can't be a political objective. If it's just a political objective and you don't apply the right science, the right engineering, the right technology, you don't get the result that you really want to have, unless, of course, the only result you really want to have is control. So that's what I'm hoping will come out of this administration, is a science-based approach to water quality, and not just a massive attempt to take over whole aspects of individual lives that impact their property and their ability to support themselves.
We have great scientists at EPA and in the Office of Water, and I rely on them every single day. And so our job is to take a look at science, contrary to what people write about. We are actually looking at science as we're making our decisions.
Well, I appreciate the fact that you're here today. I want you to answer the questions of all the colleagues on both sides of the aisle accurately and confidently, and even when it appears that you're being browbeaten, to speak truthfully about the work that you guys are trying to do. With that, Madam Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Palmer. Mr. Lowenthal, you're on the floor.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and welcome, Administrator Ross. Thank you for testifying before this committee in this hearing. Last year, the administration also proposed revisions. Another part of the provisions to the Clean Water Act were the regulations on wastewater. This blending proposal could allow for the discharge of untreated sewage into our waterways. We've seen in my district, which is a coastal district, and we've seen the results of this, what I consider misguided approach. During times of heavy rain, wastewater systems have failed, which results, then when when we allow for this weeks-long closure of our beaches and our waterways, which have to be done in order to protect the public from untreated, contaminated sewage. You know, in 2005, EPA withdrew a similar proposal, in part because of the lack of evidence that blending will not adversely affect the environment or public health. Are you aware of any new analyses of the public health or the environmental impact of blending?
The team has been done extensive stakeholder outreach and is gathering the additional information. And let me be clear, we're not talking about discharging raw sewage into the waters of the United States or in other waters. That is not what our policy proposal is about. In fact, you put your finger on the real issue is in wet weather events, if you get too much flow through secondary treatment, after the grit screens and the primary clarifiers into secondary treatment, we primarily rely, most places, on bugs. Too much water will blow out those bugs. If you don't manage that, then the actual real environmental concern that I have is that you blow those bugs out and then you don't have the wastewater treatment system up and running. And so what we're trying to grapple with is how do systems manage the secondary treatment in a wet weather event such that they don't blow out the bugs?
But you're also, we need to know, do we know how many treatment or publicly owned treatment works engage in this process of blending? And are you going to gather that? And are they monitoring? Because you said it's not, we're blowing out sewage. Are we monitoring, EPA, the presence of pathogens in these blended? And could you give us that data?
Yeah, so one, I don't have the data with me, and I know the team is looking at it, but what we really do in most circumstances where the states have authorized blending, and a lot of times the states are the ones here are the permitting authority, if they are protecting the bugs, they bring the water back into the disinfection system that takes care of the pathogens. So when they blend it back in before it gets discharged, it does get disinfection.
Well, you know, my concern is not to find some magic bullet like blending. We're really talking about investment. Too many cities have decades-old treatment infrastructure. Their capacity hasn't kept pace with population growth. But these investments depend upon federal support. Earlier, you talked about the successes of the Whiff program, and we also have the State Revolving Fund program. Both of those are the backbone of our water infrastructure investment. What I'd like you to explain to me is why this administration has proposed severe cutbacks to both those programs.
Well, there are two answers. One, I think in the administration's proposals on budgets, they're trying to balance, you know, kind of the budget fiscal responsibility, and some of the you know, the budget cuts they're proposing were to rely more on the states and the management of state resources.
So you're saying rely more on the states, and so increase or allow the states to propose these blending programs rather than provide the infrastructure, because this is an old, and in many cases, infrastructure that really needs rebuilding. And you've talked about the successes of these programs.
Yeah. So two things. One, my job first and foremost is to spend the money that Congress appropriates as intelligently, as appropriately as possible. So I get appropriations, and our job is to wheel the money out, the grant loan programs. But on the blending issue, that's actually one of the questions is right now, because there's a different regulatory regime across the country because of an Eighth Circuit decision called Iowa League of Cities. There are different rules at play depending on what state you reside in. That's not regulatory certainty for the regulated community. And what happens is there are the entities that may have to be forced to run water around to protect their bugs are faced with some kind of contingent liability, and rather than, they actually have to think about upgrading their facilities through huge capital investment rather than thinking about managing the episodic overflow. So if you're talking about infrastructure investment, it's actually, this is a more efficient way to go after it.
It may be a more range, and my time is up, but I would like to point out again that we're talking about when treatment facilities cannot handle, because of the peak flow of wastewater, and rather than investing in infrastructure, the administration is proposing cutting infrastructure investment. Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Thal. Mr. Lamalfa, you have the floor.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Appreciate it. And Mr. Ross, thank you for appearing with us today. You know, again, going back to a 2015 rule, reinterpreting the Clean Water Act of 1972 under the Obama administration, a rule likely tailor-made for environmental groups to find solace and happiness with a new interpretation. So, yet they still consistently sued the federal government from that point forward. So I guess, rhetorically, how much money do we have to spend defending the federal government's action from the environmental groups? And then on the other side of the coin, how much has to be spent preventing economic development of land that is already in production for energy or even agriculture, clearly exempt activities under the original Clean Water Act of 72. Telling farmers and ranchers, these are clearly exempt items. So, the courts could have struck down the Clean Water Act, but they went after this 2015 rule. So until last week, we had 22 states that were following one set of rules and 28 that were doing another set of rules. So we had kind of a mess there. So let me zero in on a couple things really important in my district. In Northern California, we've had activities to enforce against farming and ranching activities where fallow land had been brought back into production or maybe a change of crop. Reinterpretations of saying that you now need to go through a permit process, a 3-year long generally, and hundreds of thousands of dollars. I don't know how you can spend hundreds of thousands of dollars getting a permit to do something that's already clearly exempt under the Clean Water Act for farming and ranching specifically. We can get into mining later, but so millions of dollars of fines have been paid by some growers under WOTUS, under reinterpretation of what constitutes a need for permit under Clean Water Act. So with this ruling and with it having stood up in court, is the EPA and Army Corps, some combination, going to consider any steps to pay restitution to previous penalties that have been paid by farmers and ranchers, sometimes to the tunes of millions of dollars, as a result of this abysmal 2015 rule and it having been struck down by the courts?
That's a fairly big ticket legal question that I'm not prepared to answer. My answer is I'm not aware of any discussion of that kind.
Are you aware that at least the agency is capable of doing so, having been found that it was out of bounds?
Those are
from one administration to another, having now gone through the court process or legal process.
Yeah, at this point, those are issues that I prefer not to speculate on. What I will tell you is I am aware of two core principles. It's time for the federal government, whether or not it's Congress or EPA, to step up and give a clear definition so the goalposts stop changing, one. Two, I strongly believe in investment certainty. I used to work for the private sector. I understand what it takes to operate a business. I've represented folks who operate a business, and I understand investment certainty.
So, well, again, coming back to what rural America has been dealing with on this, some of my colleagues talked about ponds. You have people that have put together stock ponds just to store water, and the benefits of those, as was discussed, was for erosion control and flood control to an extent. All well-intended, good things happening in rural America. So I thank the agency for paying more attention and listening to what happens in rural America instead of just large buildings here in Washington, D.C. So farmers and ranchers and others that do outdoor activity are rejoicing over the direction you're going with this. But I still am concerned how much is left in the pipeline litigation-wise or what have you, that we're still going to have local enforcers like we've seen in Northern California, whether it's out of the EPA office or the Army Corps office working together to basically freeze agricultural and other activities because the threat, sometimes not even carried out, of a fine or an action against them. Can you tell me that this activity will stop and that the divisions out in the field are going to be basically instructed to stop these enforcement activities outside of the intent of the law?
Well, as a former prosecutor for a state, I can tell you that when I talked, it carried a significant chilling effect. We will continue to implement our enforcement programs under the Clean Water Act. We have a robust enforcement program. But our job is to take a look at what the law requires before you make an enforcement decision, and I can guarantee you our teams are doing that.
Yeah, I thank you for that, because again, it is about enforcing the law as written and achieving the goal of doing activities that do help keep the water clean. So with that, Madam Chair, I yield back. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Malfa. Mr. Carvajal, you have the floor.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Welcome, Administrator Ross. For the past 2.5 years, the administration has focused on an outdated 20th century energy policy to meet the needs of the 21st century. From issuing misguided executive orders promoting dirty fossil fuels, increasing oil and gas extraction, and fracking on public lands, and proposing draconian cuts to agencies like the EPA. The administration has put corporate interests above the health and safety of our communities. One of the largest cuts to the EPA budget is to the Oil Spill Prevention, Preparedness, and Response Program. How can we expect to maintain proper oversight and guard against future oil spills like my district has seen time and time again when this program is facing significant cuts?
Well, again, our job at the agency is to spend the money that Congress appropriates. And I do know the Spill Prevention Program is a robust program that, in fact, I just having conversations the other day about enforcement associated with spill prevention issues. So it's alive and well at the agency, and it's a robust program, and the teams are doing a nice job implementing it.
But with all the cuts that have occurred, do you still have the same span of control and oversight?
With all the cuts, so what actually my program has been plussed up. So in the last several years, the Office of Water has gotten more funding and more responsibility. We had dropped 32 new programs on the Office of Water. So in my personal experience, we have gone up in budget, not down.
Also in the Spill and Preparedness Program?
I can't speak to the budget on the Spill and Preparedness Program. A lot of that is run out of a different office.
Okay, because that's the one I was referring to. Right. With the cutbacks by the EPA, does this mean that compliance with environmental safety rules are less of a priority in this administration?
No, they're not. Susan Bodine does a fabulous job with the enforcement team. I'm thrilled, from a water perspective, she's focused on cutting significant non-compliance and NPDES permitting as one of her core objectives. And another major priority for the agency is to actually cut back the amount of small and medium communities that are in non-compliance with the Safe Drinking Water Act. And so the enforcement program, from my perspective, is focusing on really core areas that I care about in the Office of Water.
In California, there was a proposal to allow for fracking on over 1 million acres of public land by the Department of the Interior. At the same time, EPA is considering comments on promoting greater reuse of fracking wastewater without clearly responding about the potential risks this poses to our environment and public health. Does the EPA support requiring full disclosure of any chemical additives to fracking wastewater before that wastewater can be proposed for reuse as a source of irrigation, water on food, or potable reuse?
So in the Water Reuse Action Plan that we just proposed for public comment last week, produced water is a very significant new source of water. And we have a very long section in there to describe called fit for purpose. So as we study produced water as a potential viable new water source, we are also taking a look at whether or not it's fit for purpose. So what is it intended to be used for? Whether or not it's irrigation, surface water augmentation, groundwater recharge, manufacturing, light manufacturing reuse. The aspect of reuse has to be associated with fit for purpose. And so that is a very significant component of our water reuse action strategy.
How are you going to address the exemption that exists for fracking operations in the Safe Drinking Water Act that does not require disclosure of chemical additives?
That I actually haven't, that's not in my program, at least I think. I'll have to double check. So I don't have an answer for you, but I can answer a question for the record.
Thank you very much. Madam Chair, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Carvajal. Mr. Woodall, you have the floor.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Administrator, for being here. I appreciate the shots that you've taken on budgeting, and I appreciate your response that you spend the money that Congress appropriates to you. Yes, the administration produced a budget. I didn't like everything that was in that budget either, but that's a step higher than what this House did when we produced no budget at all this year. There's no vision of what we're going to do this year, next year, the year after that. No long-term vision of any kind. We have one responsibility on the Budget Committee in which I sit, and we could not fulfill it. So knowing you were going to take shots, the administration still put forward a budget, and I'm grateful to you for doing that. You know, we last month had a court decision in the Southern District of Georgia, case that Georgia led, dealing with the overreach of the WOTUS rule. And in that decision, the court said this, along the lines of what you said this morning. Congress has delegated the important role of protecting the nation's waters to the agencies, but in fulfilling that role, the agencies must comply with the law. All you can do is deal with the law that's in front of you, and they have failed to do just that. And the court went on to say that they were going to block any rule from going into effect as the agencies continue their efforts to change the WOTUS rule in light of the serious defects identified in the order. We need that clarity. I'll put Georgia's environmental stewardship second to none. I'm sorry to hear of other states that don't value their state's leadership. I do value our state's leadership. And I understand that you're trying to provide clarity in these revisions of the WOTUS rule. I actually value certainty even more. Clearly, the Obama administration was trying to provide certainty in 2015, and clearly they failed as that litigation continues. Can you talk a little bit about, as we go on to step two, what my expectations and the constituents' expectations should be around certainty?
Well, yeah, that is one of our core principles as we're taking a look at the new proposed definition. Rather than just trying to fix around the margins, we started over. So we tried to get to a simple number of categories of what's in, and then a very clear definition of what's out. And the number one exemption is if it's not in, it's out. And so simplicity, clarity, certainty are some of the hallmarks of what we're going after. There's some questions about how, we use the typical year construct for determining jurisdiction over adjacent wetlands. Got a lot of good public comments on that we're taking into account. We're working with our legal and our scientific and our policy teams to take a look at that. So we've got a little bit of work to do before we finalize it, but certainty, clarity is really our hallmark. In this space, perfection is a lofty goal, but our, improving and answering this once and for all, so that we have certainty, so that the courts stop changing the goalpost, and we actually have a federal rule that we can implement, that we know, as Justice Kennedy said in a concurring opinion in 2016, that he's concerned about the ominous reach of the Clean Water Act. We should not have Supreme Court justices saying that in concurring opinions.
I appreciate your pointing that out. I'm perfectly prepared to disagree with the administration about line item after line item after line item. But I'm also prepared to disagree with the courts along those lines. Our job is to write those laws. Your job is to implement those laws, and the court's role has been overblown in recent years, and I blame the Congress for many of those failures. Madam Chair, could I ask unanimous consent that we put the court case that I've referenced out of the Southern District of Georgia? It's State of Georgia v. Wheeler. Thank you, Madam Chair. I regret that you're not going to be here after the second panel testifies, because I suspect we're going to hear some concerns that you have very rapid responses to, and the timing won't be there. But I would tell you that as I see you're narrowing the scope of the enforcement responsibilities to comply within the four corners of the law, I expect you to be able to do a better job with equal resources or more resources as you narrow that focus on which the agency is targeting. And I would call that targeting an effort to serve my constituency even better and hold the nation to a higher standard on clean water generally. Is that, as you've seen it from the inside looking out, is that a fair characterization? I reject the notion that anybody's dismantling anything. It seems to me from the outside looking in that you're trying to target, focus, and do better at what we all have tasked you with doing.
That is our theory, that we focus on the waters that matter. The way the construct of the Clean Water Act, it's actually a well-written statute generally, other than maybe one definition that could have used some additional clarity. But the overall construct for the nation's waters versus the navigable waters, the federal government protects the core navigable waters, and the states have sufficient and are provided resources by Congress to help do other waters in the watershed. And it's a partnership between the states and federal government. We recognize that.
I thank you for your service to the country. I thank you for being here today. I yield back, Madam Chair.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Woodall. Mr. Ross, I want to make sure we heard you correctly. Did you say you don't have the responsibility for the Safe Drinking Water Act? Can you provide to Mr. Carvajal, for the record, and to this committee, how you propose appropriate reuse of fracking wastewater when the Drinking Water Act prohibits the disclosure of fracking chemicals?
Yeah, of course. Thank you for the opportunity to clarify, Chairwoman. Of course, I have jurisdiction over the Safe Drinking Water Act. In fact, that's where I spend most of my time. Particularly with lead and copper and emerging contaminants in this country. And so the point I was trying to get at is, regulating the identification of chemicals in frack water. I'll be honest with you, I don't know which program office has jurisdiction. It might be mine. And so that was what I was trying to get at. But more importantly, in fracking and produced water, my job, I serve as a co-chair of the Drought Resiliency Federal Partnership. And I've learned that we have drought in this country in areas like New Mexico and Oklahoma, in the Permian Basin, in
California.
Texas. And so that also happens to be where we have a lot of produced water. So it's our responsibility, our obligation, rather than locking that resource into the ground in deep water injection and never using it, is to take a look at water reuse for the drought-starved portions of the country. And that's really my focus.
How can you do that without knowing what the chemicals components are?
Well, that's why I was mentioning the fit-for-purpose reuse. There's a fit-for-purpose technology-based assessment that will go into as we look at reusing produced water. For example, augmentation for surface water flows for aquatic life.
No, we're talking about fracking water.
Yeah, well, yeah, but that water, when it comes up, before it gets reused for whatever purpose you're talking about reusing it for, we'll take a look at the end use. Is it irrigation, you'll take a look at what are the chemical constituents in it. So that's what we mean by fit for purpose. You'll take a look at what's in it before you use it.
Well, hopefully we'll be able to get a very clear definition, because I understand that the industry will not allow to disclose what components they have, what chemicals they have in that water. Mr. Delgado, you have the floor.
Thank you, Chairwoman. Thank you, Mr. Ross, for being here. You just testified that you spend most of your time dealing with the Safe Drinking Water Act, and you also referenced emerging contaminants. I want to focus the questioning in this arena. You testified earlier that PFAS, PFOAs are a risk to human health, correct?
Yes.
And these risks would include things like autoimmune disorders, cancer, kidney disease, thyroid conditions, correct?
Yeah, so for the chemicals that we have the toxicological profiles on, yes, those are some of the health concerns that we have identified.
You would agree those are very serious conditions?
Yeah, to the people who are exposed, yes.
And you would agree that we should take some pretty important, critical steps to get in front of those conditions?
That is why we have developed the National Action Plan, to get out in front and answer the scientific questions where we don't know the answers, and to begin the process to grapple with the chemicals that we do know about.
And on that plan, do you intend to issue a maximum contaminant level?
Well, the process that I have to follow is the Safe Drinking Water process established by Congress in 1996, and it's a multiple-step process. The first step in that process is to issue a regulatory determination. We've committed to doing that by the end of the year, and the teams are on pace to do that.
I don't know if I heard an answer to my question. My question was, when you issue the plan, do you intend to detail an MCL?
If I say right now we intend to do an MCL, then I've determined the outcome of the rulemaking, and I will be challenged as not having an open mind. So I'm following the Safe Drinking Water Act process that Congress established for me. The first step in that process is to do the regulatory determination.
Do you think that there can be a scenario where you complete that plan, and that plan is viable and has merit in the absence of an MCL?
In the absence, I guess
You're suggesting that you can go through this whole process and ultimately not land on an MCL.
that is the process that Congress established for us. And what I'm saying is we go through the process, we rely on the
I'm sorry,
science.
when you say that the process that Congress has established is you can go through this exercise and ultimately conclude we're not in a position to state what the maximum contaminant level is?
So the agency has done multiple regulatory determinations for a variety of chemicals over the years. When they move forward with a determination as a positive regulatory determination, meaning that there's an occurrence at a level that we can see, there are health effects at levels that we're concerned about, and there's something that the federal government can do about it to regulate three primary core considerations we do in the Safe Drinking Water Act. Then you move into the next step of the process, which is to go out to our advisory boards, go out for public comment, find out whether or not we've made that first determination correctly, and if you make the determination at the back end of that yes, we have the ability to answer all those questions and move forward with an MCL, we do. At the end of
So let me stop you there. So that's a very elongated process you just laid out, correct?
Yes.
You've acknowledged earlier that this is some serious risk health effects, right?
Yes.
And we know this to be the case. The science says that as much.
Yes.
Correct? Right. So what I'm trying to get my mind wrapped around is how is it from your vantage point that what you've just detailed actually reflects the mission of the EPA, which is to protect human health?
Because that's the statute that Congress gave me. I have to follow the law.
What I'm trying to understand is, let's say you follow the law, as you very well should, and you're telling me that the law is telling you there can be a scenario whereby you do all of this research, you go through all these advisory boards, you do all of this effort. Meanwhile, parents are losing their lives, as some of my constituents have had to endure. Mothers are giving birth to newborns with increased levels of exposure to these contaminants. And you're telling me that we'll sit and we'll wait and we'll wait. Meanwhile, states like New York are issuing maximum contaminant levels for certain PFOA chemicals. So you're seeing all these other actors move in one direction to get out in front of this problem. And you want folks all across this country to continue to wait and wait and wait on the off chance, potentially, that maybe we'll get to a point where we just might have enough information to issue an MCL. Is that what you're telling me?
No.
What are you telling me?
So there are other parameters that, like groundwater cleanup standards. So where we see that we have exposure, particularly near airfields, you can deal with the groundwater cleanup and put treatment techniques in on the water supply. And so we are working with the states and the local governments and our federal partners to do that. We are also moving forward with
I want to focus on the MCL. The MCL, we have to be able to set a maximum contaminant level for public water. You spend most of your time in the safe drinking water area. This is what you do. You've articulated this now. So what I'm trying to understand is where is the focus on getting to a point where we can ensure the public we know the maximum contaminant level of something that we know causes cancer, thyroid diseases, autoimmune disorders. We know this, the science says so. Act like it. Why aren't we acting like it?
We are acting like it. We've committed to do this.
You're not. You're
safe
telling me
drinking
you
water
got
process.
18 different steps to go through before you can do anything.
That is the process that you, Congress, gave me to follow.
But you're not even including,
Which
you're not
steps
even
should I-
saying,
which
sir,
steps-
you're not even saying, sir, you're not even saying, okay, be patient, we'll give it to you. You can't even say that. What you're saying is, wait, give us some time, but I can't guarantee you we'll give you anything.
As a federal regulator, if I tell you the outcome of my regulatory process,
I'm not asking for the limit. I'm not asking for you to define for me what the limit is. I'm asking you to commit to the fact that you will do everything in your power to land on an MCL that the public can rely upon.
That is exactly what we've committed to do. We've committed to begin the process
Then
and
just
do
say
the
so.
MCL.
Then just say we will commit to providing an MCL.
You're asking me to presume the
Yes or
outcome
no?
of my rulemaking.
Will you commit to the public that you will rely on the science for as long as it takes? Let's just take it off the table. But at some point, you will provide an MCL.
I will rely on the scientists. I rely on the scientists every single day, and they're the
I'm
ones
done. Thank you.
driving this process.
Thank you, Mr. Delgado. Mr. Babin, you have the floor.
If you would like to continue explaining about the science, I would like to hear what you have to say, Mr. Administrator.
Yeah, so, well, thank you for that question. So, the process of establishing an MCL requires us to take a look at all available science. We take a look at the occurrence data. What we have for PFOA and PFAS suggests that in about 2% of our drinking water systems. The state of Michigan has gone through and analyzed all of their water systems. Several other states are starting to develop MCLs because they have the authority under state law. The way the system is designed by Congress is we have a process that we go through, and if the states have the authority to move quicker and have concerns for the local citizens, they have the ability to do that, and the states are doing that. That's the way the system's designed. But what I have done is always taken into account, in fact, on the MCL and on taking a look at the toxicological profiles, we have amazing scientists in the Office of Science Technology and the Office of Research and Development. They're the ones telling us what the occurrence data is, what the health effects are, what we need to do from a toxicological profile, and they're leading the charge. Our job is to give them the resources to do their jobs, and that's exactly what we're doing.
Okay, thank you very much. I have the privilege of representing Southeast Texas, which is an area that serves as a major gateway for the U.S. trade and is home to some of the country's most significant infrastructure, including one of the busiest ports in the country, and that's the Port of Houston. It's an essential piece of our nation's thriving economy and really the hub of our energy industry. Oil and gas sectors continue to be leading the world, in addition to continuing to improve our air quality over the years. As you know, the EPA's recently proposed rule to Section 401 of the CWA has the opportunity to play a significant role in expediting the review process for infrastructure projects, while simultaneously maintaining and promoting strong environmental practices. This new proposal will provide greater clarity and regulatory certainty for our country's water quality certification process. Some on the left are saying that this administration is guilty of a double standard when it comes to states' rights, particularly as it relates to Section 401, the state certifications under the Clean Water Act. Is the EPA trying to limit states' rights when it comes to protecting water quality under the 401 certification process?
No, definitely not. I've worked for a couple of states, I believe, fundamentally in state rights. Our overall portfolio is to protect and respect state rights. In this particular circumstance, the 401 provision is older than I am. It's actually older than the Clean Water Act, the way EPA's regulations have been adopted. It's time to modernize it. Right now, the courts are beginning to answer questions for us that the agency should be providing in a modern, up-to-date regulations. We're working through the process right now, but no, we're not restricting state rights.
Okay, and isn't it true that some states have interpreted the language in Section 401 as allowing them to use that certification authority to impose requirements that go beyond water quality related requirements, thereby essentially turning the 401 process into another broad environmental review process like under NEPA?
I do believe that the 401 process is a water quality certification. That's what the statute says. And so we should be looking at the water quality impacts of discharges associated with the federal permits that the states then get to weigh in and determine whether or not the federal permit also satisfies their water quality standards within their state. And so it's a water quality provision. That's what we've said in our proposal, and we'll look forward to hearing the comments from our stakeholders.
Well, under that, aren't such states that go beyond water quality related requirements under the 401 process essentially and effectively using the Section 401 certification process as a weapon of such to delay infrastructure and other projects at the expense of significant regional and national benefits, including increased energy security, energy reliability, economic development, and job creation?
Well, we are aware of delays in certain infrastructure and energy-related developments, particularly because of the Congress basically said the states have a year, up to a year, to do the certification. And the way the system has been developed is someone submits an application. If they don't get it done in a year, they send it back, they resubmit, send it back, resubmit. And it could take 4 or 5 years to go through this process that Congress clearly said there was a year to do. And so one of the things that we're trying to fix is provide clarity and certainty around the one-year provision.
Thank you. Madam Chair, I'll yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Bevan. Mr. Malinowski, you have the floor.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Ross, we've obviously made a lot of progress as a country since the days of burning rivers, but in its most recent report to Congress, EPA reported that more than 50% of the rivers and streams it assessed are impaired, nearly 80% of bays and estuaries, 91% of ocean and near coastal waters, 100% of the Great Lakes open waters. Would you agree that it is important to get those numbers down?
Absolutely. The Clean Water Act has been very, very successful, but there's certainly a lot more work the states and the federal government need to do.
Can you name a single major initiative that this administration has taken on the regulatory front that has as its expected effect significantly reducing those numbers?
Well, yeah, so since 2017, we have approved 5,000 total maximum daily loads. We have approved about 240 water quality standards, including reducing the backlog that the agency failed to act on that the states submit, so therefore improving water quality through those states. We've decreased the backlog and have approved several hundred MPDS permits that the federal government regulates. I've developed a new water quality trading policy. We've developed aluminum criteria. We've developed saline criteria in California, and I could go on and on. So we've taken several major initiatives.
Okay, well, I'm seeing over 80 environmental rules weakened or in the process of being weakened. With Waters of the U.S., we've talked about rules regulating toxic discharge, including mercury from power plants. We've talked about the blending proposal, which may allow untreated sewage into our rivers and streams. We've talked about Section 401. How are any of these steps intended to or likely to have the effect of significantly altering the numbers that I just read?
One,
not motivated by that.
Because what is not being reported is the amazing work of the Office of Water and the agency and the regional offices every single day. What gets reported is a few of the big ticket issues. 95% of the agency continues to go on and performs its mission. There are a few big ticket issues that we're grappling with, like the definition of WOTUS, that I'm trying to restore the rule of law associated with. And so I'd love to spend some time educating you about the portfolio of the Office of Water, because the agency does an amazing job.
I'm trying to get at motivation here. You know, sir, you said a couple of times, in fact, at one point in this hearing, that you have two clear principles that guide your work. One of them, something to do with not moving goalposts. The second was investment certainty. And I agree with both of those goals, but I was really struck. You're with the EPA. You're in charge of clean water. Why wasn't the first principle protecting the health and safety of the American people? You've had several opportunities to come to us and to demonstrate that the first thing you think about when you wake up in the morning is protecting our kids. And yet what you keep coming back to is investor certainty, rule of law. Do you work for the Commerce Department, sir?
So, no, of course I don't. And that was an answer to that question. In my opening statement, I actually focused on big ticket water infrastructure, water reuse, working for the water sector and concerns about our workforce. So every single day I care about and work for. We went into this business because you care about the environment. That was one answer to one question, and of course, I have multiple core principles.
There was several answers to the question. You keep on coming back to the rule of law, so let me ask you about that. In the President's executive order on defining the scope of clean water protections, he directed the EPA and the Corps to develop a rule that relies on a plurality opinion by Justice Scalia in a case about 13 years ago. I think it was Rapanos versus the U.S. As the sole basis of asserting these protections. Do you recall how many justices on the court supported that plurality opinion?
One, the executive order said we should be informed by, but we're not bound by. So the other thing is, on that opinion, there were 3 justices that joined Justice Scalia, so that's 4. Justice Kennedy actually concurred. What people forget about is that Justice Kennedy joined Scalia to overturn the overreach of the federal action in that case.
Well, 5 justices opposed the Scalia opinion, and we're talking about the rule of law here based on a plurality opinion that no court in the 13 years since has said should be binding on anyone or anything. So I don't think that your constant references to the rule of law are particularly convincing. The role of the EPA, I have some sense of what your role is. You are not the agency in the U.S. government that is supposed to be fundamentally concerned with investor protection. There are other agencies that have that very legitimate purpose. Your job is to be sitting in there arguing often as the lonely voice in the federal government for people. And I have not heard a lot of that ethos expressed here today. Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Malinowski. Next, we have Ms. Gonzalez-Colon. You have the floor.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Ross, would you like to have any additional time to respond to the previous question?
Yeah, you know, the allegation that we're not concerned about the environment is just fundamentally false. It's a nice talking point. If you're talking about investment certainty, you know, one of the most important things that Congress and EPA has done over the years is to work with our infrastructure, upgrade our drinking water systems and our wastewater systems. Those are multiple hundreds of millions or tens of millions of dollars of investment. If facilities and cities and states go through asset management planning and they have 10, 15, 20, 30, 40-year parameters and they're thinking about how to use their taxpayer money and before raising rates for the individual taxpayer, you have to have rules of the game that they understand so they can do their asset management planning so they can figure out whether or not to spend money on drinking water, stormwater, wastewater, whatever it is. And so if you keep changing the rules of the game, how are cities and states supposed to plan their affairs accordingly? And so we think about environmental protection every single day. And so I understand, this role is to take some of those comments. But I am very, very, very thrilled and pleased with the work of the Office of the Water. The career employers are fantastic. I learn from them every day, and I see their passion every day.
Actually, I'm going to piggyback on that. One of the biggest complaints we receive about the program is that the regulatory patchwork based solely upon the geographic part you are. With the revision, again, back to 2015, pre-regulations that are currently in more than half of the states, how long will it take for states and territories for actually adopt the same standards?
Sorry, there was some noise over here. I couldn't hear the last part of that question.
Yeah, I mean, with the revision back to pre-2015 standards, regulations that are currently in half of the states, how long it will take for states and territories to actually get to the regular standards, everybody in the same page?
Yeah. Well, so that's I guess the curse of litigation. So there's a 60-day implementation period for we finished step one. It'll take 60 days before it becomes effective, which theoretically that will restore the common operating platform across all 50 states. If it's litigated, it's possible that litigation will shut it down in some or portions of the country. And so this story, I believe, will probably continue. We're doing our best. We're controlling what we can. And our litigators, it's a defensible rule. That's why we spent so much time doing it. I know there was concern about we were not moving fast enough, but we moved as quickly as we could so that we could make it defensible. So when it went through the litigation, it will defend it. So, the story's not done, but we've done what we can to restore certainty while we develop our second step 2 rule, which we'll finish this winter.
I really appreciated you highlighting the importance of the role of the clean water and drinking water state revolving fund in order to reduce water pollution and public health threats. Because in the case of Puerto Rico, after 2016, we were not able to pay our loans. And finally, in August of this year, we actually got through the restoration of the $571 million in principal to that revolving fund, and that will help us out in some of the cleanups that you just mandated. As a matter of fact, you just asked for sewer repairs in Puerto Rico, Manatee, San German, and we are very glad that for the first time in many years, the regional director of Mr. Pete Lopez from New York has been helping Puerto Rico out. So thank you for that. I yield back.
Yeah, Pete Lopez is passionate about Puerto Rico, and I can tell you, restoring the SRF was our office director, Andrew Sawyers, invested huge, significant investment of his time and resources to get that back up and running. When we made that announcement, that was a really great day.
I will just add to this. Every time we call him, and we do have several situations in Puerto Rico after the hurricane, and I need to say the EPA has been there every time we've been asking for and helping the state to manage many of those incidents regarding not just water, but 97% of the drinking water in Puerto Rico is provided by Puerto Rico Water Authority, which is state-owned, basically. So thank you for that assistance, and my congrats to Mr. Pete Lopez. Are you back?
Thank you. The chair now recognizes Representative Pappas. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and Mr. Ross, thanks for being with us today. I want to build off some of the comments of my colleague, Mr. Delgado, because the folks of New Hampshire's 1st District are experiencing PFAS contamination at the same levels of residents of his district. This is beyond an emerging contaminant in my state. It has emerged. It is impacting the health of individuals, and we need to demand more from the EPA. I'm frustrated as well that we don't have the same level of urgency in our federal government that we do from state office holders in New Hampshire. Our state recently set new aggressive levels for PFAS in drinking water. Other states have done that as well. We need a federal solution on this because states don't necessarily have the expertise at their fingertips, the capacity to be able to do this. We need a standard across the country that's going to protect public health and drinking water. And I understand that there's a process, but we want you to share the urgency that people who have been exposed to PFAS contamination have.
You have my commitment. We share the urgency. I know that for the people who are exposed in the communities, that's unsatisfying for me to say that. But I can tell you, based on the career team, the scientists and the regulators that we have working on it, they have an urgency. They're working on it holistically, not just in the drinking water program, but in our Office of Lands and Emergency Management and our TSCA program. It is an agency-wide initiative. It is a core principle of the Administrator Wheeler to push forward on PFAS, and we're doing everything we can as quickly as we can. We understand there's frustration that sometimes the federal bureaucracy is part of it. The Safe Drinking Water Act, for example, was established to make sure that we engage with our stakeholders, engage with our scientists and our advisory boards. But I understand that if we go through that process, the outside world and some of the people who are affected may believe that it's not going fast enough, and I acknowledge that.
We're counting on you to get something done. I was recently at Pease Air Force Base in Portsmouth. The Air Force has financed a treatment system for groundwater there. They have levels that are hundreds of thousands of parts per trillion, far exceeding the 70 parts per trillion prevailing health advisory by the EPA, and far exceeding the new standards that New Hampshire released. They told me it's going to take, if not decades, centuries perhaps, to treat all the groundwater in that area so that it's safe to drink. So we're talking about a problem, when you look across the country, just on military bases, that is quite significant. I'm wondering if we could shift to industrial pollution sites. I don't know if you're aware of how many active industrial polluters there are of facilities that are discharging PFAS into lakes and rivers.
Well, I don't have the data in front of me, but my team actually, we're putting an effluent limitation guidelines plan. We do that every couple of years. That's out. We've got 4 or 5 pages dedicated to this, and we're beginning to take a look at the various forms of dischargers and based on the sectors of the economy in which they operate. And so the agency, as part of our PFAS action plan, we are looking at that.
So experts estimate there are about 500,000 active industrial facilities that are discharging PFAS into lakes and rivers and bodies of water in this country. That's a serious concern, and I'm wondering if you could just confirm that you believe that there should be limits on PFAS discharge from such sites.
Well, so we have a couple of facilities, for example, in West Virginia and North Carolina that are subject to discharge limits. They're the manufacturers. We are taking a look at what other sectors would we have the authority to regulate, and do we have the ability to regulate, and that's part of our effluent limitation guidelines plan. So we're taking a look at it. That plan will be coming out fairly soon, but it's in the action plan. It's one of our things that we took a look at over the next couple of years. Obviously, to regulate all at the time, you have to have the science, you have to have the data, and so we're going to focus in on the higher priority areas.
Fairly soon. Can you narrow that down for us?
The publication of some of these plans, I don't have the details in my at my fingertips. I can get back to you on that. But I know I've signed off on the last on the effluent limitation guidelines plan. It's going through the publication process. Quite frankly, where in that process, I just don't have the answer, but I can get it for you.
Well, the way we can really protect public health from the threat PFAS poses is to first stop the contamination, stop this situation from getting worse, ensure that there's treatment of groundwater, that people have access to safe drinking water, and then work at making sure that we get these chemicals off the market. They're called forever chemicals for a reason. They stick around in the environment for a long, long time. and they have been linked to serious chronic health conditions from cancer to thyroid issues. We've got to make sure we're doing more on this. This is going to be found all across the country when we test for it, and we need our EPA to be on the front lines of this with up-to-date science, working hard with that sense of urgency to protect the public.
Yeah, you've made the argument for why why we developed a holistic action plan, and the core component and our primary focus. Well, I shouldn't say our primary. That's the wrong word. One of our main focuses is on closing the scientific gap. And so there is a huge amount of work happening in the Office of Research and Development and with our federal partners on how to close the scientific information gap. And we're also working on trying to figure out ways to identify more chemicals in basically environmental media. And so all of that is happening as part of our action plan. And if we were just laser focused on one issue, we would ignore the holistic picture.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Pappas. The chair now recognizes Representative Gibbs for 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Mr. Ross, for being here today, and thank you for all the work you do to protect our environment. When I was chair of this committee for 6 years, the subcommittee, I always said during the WOTUS discussion that the Clean Water Act was passed in '72 to be a partnership between the federal government and the state governments, and the state governments are responsible for the implementation and enforcement of the Clean Water Act under the guidance of the federal government. Is that a true statement?
Yeah, as part of the providing authority for the states to run the program, they have to be able to enforce the law.
And they do send reports frequently or timely or are required to?
Yeah, we report on our performance, and in fact, I used to run an environmental protection unit, was responsible for enforcement in the state, and so I actually have firsthand knowledge on that.
One of my concerns has always been during the Obama administration on their Waters United States proposal implementation that they tried to do, was that one size fits all, because you expand this map, include all the things under federal jurisdiction. I always made the argument that we could actually go backwards in the progress we've made in point source and non-point source pollution. And the reason I say we go backwards, because at some point, businesses, farmers, everybody wants to do the right thing, okay? But when you layer on so much red tape and bureaucracy, at some point, they kind of just throw their hands up in the air and only going to do what they're going to need to do to get by and may not go that extra mile. Do you think that's a true statement too, that that's a possibility?
Well, I know there's frustration in the regulated community. My experience is that base, people will do the right thing to protect the environment. But I do sense the frustration if the goalposts keep moving. And so it's
well, I as a former hog farmer, it was illegal for me to go out and dump hog manure in the ditch or whatever, and even though it was on a federal waterway. And so there's been lots of editorials recently, because it's just all with the move by the Trump administration on this issue, that the editorials actually come out and say that this opens up the door for businesses to pollute because the feds aren't regulating this. And as you and I both know, that's not true. It was illegal for me to do that. The states are doing that. And my point is, when the feds open us up in one size fits all out of Washington, D.C., what the issue comes about is it creates more confusion, more red tape, and the states wouldn't do as much as they might have done because they think the feds are going to do it, and we can actually go backwards. And I've held that opinion, and I think it's absolutely true. So I'm glad to see that the Trump administration is moving forward with common sense to really implement what the Clean Water Act's purpose really was, and Justice Scalia's in the Rampos decision kind of stated that federal jurisdiction should be waters, that waters can't be there intermittently, meaning that exempts road ditches from the federal aspect, but not the state aspect, and there has to be some type of features. I think you meant stream banks, if I interpret that correctly. So I just want to make the point here that all waters are being regulated, and small streams, road ditches, and all that kind of stuff is better regulated at the local level, the state level, because they have a better hands-on than one size fits all out of Washington, D.C. And as you in your position now, would you concur that's kind of the way it should work? And it work better that way?
That's the way Congress set it up. Yeah. That's the structure of the Clean Water Act, is to focus on the core waters under federal jurisdiction and to provide resources to the states and allow the states to regulate that which they think is more local.
I do want to mention quickly, the President signed the integrated planning legislation here in January, the bill I sponsored. Can you give us a quick update? What's happening with that? You know, is the EPA reaching out to communities that are under enforcement actions to make them aware of opportunities are out there to try to get to where we want to get to, where we are in integrated planning?
Well, let me thank you for the legislation. This country really does need to focus on integrated planning. Well, then it's stormwater, wastewater, drinking water, it all comes back to the same ratepayer, the same taxpayer. Yep. And so if you truly understand local asset management planning, integrated planning has to be part of the conversation. And so we are robustly embracing integrated planning. It comes up quite a bit in the combined sewer overflow context. And we are working with the Department of Justice and our regulated community to provide additional flexibility to make sure that, you know, for example, if someone, rather than investing $1 billion in a pipe in the ground, they can do $600 million, I'm just making this up, in green infrastructure and get stormwater management benefits and green space and the environmental benefits of the green infrastructure, we should embrace that, and I think we are.
Help keep that stormwater out of our sanitary system, right?
It's in fact, that's one of the reasons I actually included stormwater in the water use action plan that we dropped last week. Yeah, is it reuse? It's an interesting question, but it's certainly it's a source of water that we should be looking at as a new form of water if we handle it and manage it and treat it correctly.
I thank you. I'm out of time. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Gibbs. The chair now recognizes Congresswoman Fletcher for 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Ross, for being here today. I represent the 7th Congressional District of Texas in Houston, and we are no strangers to pollution when it comes to our waterways. Just this year, we had a major incident when a chemical fire at the Intercontinental Terminals Company raged so uncontrollably that a containment dike failed, spilling countless chemicals into the Houston Ship Channel, and the evidence suggests all the way into Galveston Bay. And this hasn't been the only chemical spill that we've seen recently. In 2014, as you know, a chemical storage facility in West Virginia released an estimated 10,000 gallons of coal processing chemicals upstream of a drinking water intake pipe that left more than 300,000 residents without drinking water for more than a week. Despite these events and the general risk associated with them, the Trump administration EPA recommended no new requirements under the Clean Water Act to prevent the release of hazardous substances or to require public notification. And earlier this month, EPA reversed its 2016 decision to issue new rules to safeguard against the release of hazardous substances into local water bodies and drinking water sources. I would like to know why the decision to the determination that it wasn't necessary to look at the hazardous substances earlier this month, why that took place and what data led your agency to make that determination.
Well, so that is actually rulemaking that's out of our Office of Lands and Emergency Management, and so they ran the rulemaking, so I can't speak to the specific detail in the decision-making. I'm aware that they did take a look at some of the former chemical spills and took a look at the scope of authority that the agencies have, for example, under my program, and MPDS permitting, or under the enforcement program to go after those spills. They took a look at 9 common areas and decided that based on the scope of our existing authorities, they have the ability to manage it. But as far as specific decision-making, that is not my program, and I really should, I'd have to defer to Peter Wright, who's the AA of that office.
Well, you would agree with me, would you not, that the public has the right to know when their water has been contaminated by chemicals or compromised by chemical release?
Yeah, and we have the community right to know, lots of notifications. The state have notification requirements, and so a lot of the notification is built into our existing systems.
So how many spills have there been since the Charleston incident that have been severe enough to contaminate local water sources?
I don't have that data.
It's my understanding that there have been approximately 600 chemical spills in the last 3 years. Have you heard that number?
No, that's not my program, so I haven't focused on that specific data.
Okay. Do you agree with me that it's important, if there have been, let's just assume that that number is correct, that it was 600 spills in the last 3 years, do you agree with me that additional measures to reduce or eliminate chemical spills would be an important thing to protect public drinking water?
I would have to take a look at the causes of the spill, the response action, and things like that. So I can't speculate.
Do you know whether the existing EPA programs have caught or been able to identify those chemical spills through the programs that you previously described?
Again, that would be for another office to answer those questions, and I'm happy to take those back and have questions for the record.
Yeah, I think it would be helpful to get answers to those questions. Certainly, some of my colleagues have talked about concerns that residents have about PFAS chemicals, PFOA. That's certainly true in Texas. We are attuned to that as well, and I think that what we are concerned about is accountability and making sure that we have the information. As you know, the ITC chemical fire raised serious concerns about our air quality, but also water quality, and that has a lasting impact. And so we have a heightened awareness about the potential risks of chemicals in our water, and request that you get that information back to us so that we can take the appropriate action to make sure that public drinking water is safe and that public health is prioritized. And with that, I will yield back.
Thank you, Representative Fletcher. The chair now recognizes Representative Massey for 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Chairman. The home builders in my district, the people who are providing services to the homes, like the sewer districts, they all understand that there has to be some regulation, and they don't want to pollute. But the two things that I hear from them and all of my constituents is that we need to improve clarity and reduce disparity, because they can deal with these. These are costs of doing business. They get passed on to the consumer, so we should strive to minimize them while taking care of the environment. But the problem is, if you don't have clarity on, like you were talking about the maps, the lack of maps from prior administrations, they're shooting in the dark. And then if they get treated one way on one project, and then they go to another project in a different state or a different district, they're treated another way. And these create uncertainty and hardships, not just for those providers, but for the customers. So, the former EPA administrator said that their rule was based on science. Yet when I looked at the rule, there were no units of measure, there were no numbers. Like, it was words like moderate flow, heavy flow, intermittent. These things need to be defined in order to improve the clarity and reduce the disparity. Some of my constituents, and I know some of these issues are Army Corps issues, and maybe that's one of the problems we have here. There are a couple silos. But one of the recommendations that I've heard from my district, where there's a consent decree, they're under a consent decree that's going to cost the sewer district, which will be passed on to the ratepayers, hundreds of millions of dollars. One of the questions they asked is, and this is what the developers are asking too, all of this money that the developers are paying in to the mitigation banks, which frankly some of it goes to some dubious projects. If you go inspect these projects, it's not clear whether they've improved the environment or the condition of the stream or not. And some of it just goes into buying rural land and locking it up forever from development, which exacerbates rural poverty. When they're trying to save the environment by buying up land in rural counties, it creates hardships for those counties. And it takes stuff off the tax rolls. So here's what they've recommended to me, and I said, this idea will never catch on in DC because it makes too much sense. It's common sense, which this is what they want to do. Take the money that the developers are paying in mitigation fees when they build homes for new home buyers and use it for the consent decree to actually use the money, the mitigation money, okay? Ostensibly, the developers are having an impact on the environment. Instead of spending that money on projects we're not quite sure, it's hard to prove they improve the environment, why don't we spend it on the neediest projects, which are these sewer overflows that are in the district? Like, what do you think of that idea? I know it's gonna sound crazy to everybody here because it makes sense everywhere else, but.
Well, there's a lot to unpack there. So from a high level, and in fact, in former position in the state is, I believe that you should apply your resources where you get the best economic and environmental value, and more importantly, the environmental public health protection value. And so that's one of the reasons why we're taking a look at updating and modernizing our mitigation policies. For example, in my water quality trading policy that we developed in February, one of the 6 core principles is encouraging multi-use banks. So not just for wetland mitigation or water quality trading, but also species conservation. So that we work with our federal partners to take a look at landscape scale conservation and bring multiple sources of revenue to provide a higher level ecological lift for whatever bank that you're talking about. We're updating the, working with the Corps of Engineers. We've worked really hard to break down the silos between those federal agencies and have a great working relationship with them. We're updating our compensatory mitigation rule with the Corps taking the lead on that. We're working with the Corps on things like if you're taking out a check dam to try to repair riparian corridor and there's a little bit of fringe habitat around a pond behind the check dam, there was a disincentive to do the check dam removal and repair the stream, because if you had to compensate or offset the impact of the fringe wetland on the pond, it may make it economically unviable. And so we're working with the Corps to modernize those types of mitigation policies. So at a high level, I agree with you that we need to be more creative in how we use our mitigation and get the best bang for the buck.
And one of the mitigations I would recommend that they be more flexible in granting, because it's fallen out of favor recently, is allowing the developer to mitigate on the property there locally. Like, what can you do to improve things there locally where people will see the benefit instead of putting it into this black hole where you're not sure what the money's being spent on? It's actually more efficient that way, I think.
Time has expired, but the witness can answer the question.
Yeah, that's a historic question. Back in the day, it was on-site, and we found that if you didn't have the sophistication to operate and manage the wetland, for example, wetland mitigation going forward, 10, 15 years later, you may have had a decline in the resource. And so there has to be some balance between the sophistication of the entity who manages the resource going forward. Sometimes it's a local landowner, but sometimes not.
Thank you, Mr. Massey. Chair now recognizes myself for 5 minutes of questioning. Mr. Ross, good to have you here again and to hear your testimony. I want to point out the fact I think clean water is a bipartisan affair. We all want to make sure that our children and our family and our community has access to safe drinking water. And I also want Americans to fully understand the challenge of PFAS in our drinking water and our food chain. So just to help clarify, we know that PFOA and PFOS is not being used as it has been in the past. And we even heard testimony last week from 3M that they voluntarily stopped using it and selling it, a highly profitable product. And the reason they probably did that was because they recognized the environmental impact and the potential liability that resulted in a $875 million settlement, not a judgment, settlement with the state of Minnesota. There are 5,000, roughly 5,000 to 6,000 chemicals in the PFAS family. Is it your belief that all or most of these have health consequences?
We simply don't know, which is why our scientists are working on developing toxicological profiles for the next batch of chemicals, and more importantly, looking at high-throughput toxicology work that takes a look at the group of chemicals to figure out if we can sort of weight which ones may warrant quicker, faster study. And so,
but they're all the same class.
We don't know.
They're all in the same class. We have studies out there, even internal 3M studies that show that accumulation of PFAS, whether it's PFOA, PFOS, or the full range of even short chain compounds, can cause negative consequences. Are you concerned that the American public is the guinea pig here as we determine the effect of these compounds on our health?
Well, these chemicals have been in production since the 1940s and are part of our everyday life, including
literally.
Yeah, literally, and including putting out fires and saving lives on Navy ships and at airports, and in the medical community relies on these. And so, the challenge is, as I've learned from the toxicologists, for example, in the tox work we're doing on Gen X and PFBS, you're seeing shorter chains but yet they still have adverse health effects, but they're different health effects than the PFOA and PFOS. And so we really, right now, the short answer is our scientists need time to really figure this out, and that's one of the primary goals of the agency right now, is give our scientists the leeway to run and develop and close the information gap.
So when I look at the overall concerns, though, you've got a parts per trillion of 70 issued by the EPA. Clearly, there is some scientific evidence that the EPA decided to use that number as the benchmark, where above that is concerning for an individual's health. So even though you haven't done the toxicity studies on every single compound, you have drawn the conclusion that 70 is a benchmark for all compounds, correct?
For PFOA and PFOS, those two compounds.
Okay.
And that was based on specific studies supporting both the PFOA, PFOA, and PFOS. But as far as the standards, you know, there are chemicals that we don't know the toxicological profile for, and so we don't know what the number would be if we would go through and establish a health advisory, and that's the information that we're trying to gather.
And again, I emphasize the concern is that we may be looking back 5, 10, 15 years from now and wondering why this body and the EPA did not take action on a class of chemicals that they knew were diminishing the health of Americans and allowing it to be dumped in rivers and allowing it to be used on crops, to be introduced into our food chain, and us not taking action quick enough or deep enough to address this issue. Are you concerned about the EPA not moving fast enough in this regard?
Well, I'll tell you, actually, it's one of the reasons when I was talking to our drinking water program and learning from the scientists early last year, I didn't want to be the person looking back 10 years from now and saying EPA missed it. And it's one of the reasons why we established the leadership summit that we held, the listening sessions throughout the country, and the development of the action plan. It was designed specifically to make sure that we weren't looking back 10, 15 years from now and said we missed it. And so that was definitely in my forefront of my mind as we were thinking about developing the action plan.
And as that action plan comes forth and you get the studies done, if we learn that much of the drinking water, significant amounts of the drinking water being consumed by Americans in everyday life is above certain levels. When you look at the remediation that would have to take place, and right now the best technology to do that is reverse osmosis, which is basically desalination. We're talking major expenses for every single water district that's affected with high volumes of PFAS chemicals. How do you envision us being able to address that? And my point really being, the sooner we address the dissemination of those chemicals into the environment, the less likelihood we're going to spend a hell of a lot of money on cleanup through improved water.
Yeah. Well, and it's one of the things is, you know, we're actually taking a look at the technology, the treatments, because carbon absorption actually takes care of some of the compounds, and does that actually gather additional longer chain compounds versus shorter chain compounds? Yes, reverse osmosis is out there. We actually have to take a look at, does reverse osmosis cover everything? And so, yeah, it's very, very expensive treatment on the back end, which is one of the reasons why we're really focused on, you know, in the short term, where you have exposure, particularly in groundwater near airfields, trying to get the treatment up and running.
I'd like to get one last question in here, because I'm a little confused by some of the questions about states' rights when it comes to addressing this issue. And on the other hand, we have a president who is constantly trying to take away California's rights in addressing environmental issues. Is it your testimony or your belief that states should be the primary holders of how we manage the PFAS class of chemicals, or is that do you expect to have an EPA level set for each of these?
Well, I think we need all of the above. Local, state, and federal government, we all have a role to play. That's the system that we have, and so while EPA uses its authorities to address PFAS, the states are using their authorities, and local communities are as well. So we need an all of the above strategy. That's my position.
Okay, thank you very much, and I yield back. The chair now recognizes Mr. Garrett for 5 minutes of questioning. Excuse me, Mr. Graves, for 5 minutes of questioning.
We're so close, we're on a first-name basis.
That's right.
Thank you. Administrator Ross, thank you for being here. Appreciate it. I represent South Louisiana. We've gone through the longest period of the Mississippi River at flood stage ever recorded. My point is that we drain from Montana to New York to Canada, one of the largest watersheds in the world, and the hydrology of South Louisiana is very different than virtually anywhere else. Do you believe that under the standard established during the Obama administration that there was appropriate clarity for areas like Louisiana where I could read it and having previously worked in a role where I dealt with regulations, in reading it myself, I believe that I could have applied that to virtually anywhere in South Louisiana, anywhere. Do you believe that the clarity or the specificity in the Obama era definition was appropriate, or do you think that it needed more clarification and definition, especially for areas like South Louisiana?
Yeah, well, one, I want to say I had an opportunity to co-host a hypoxia task force along the banks of Baton Rouge and learn firsthand about the water challenges down there, and it was extremely informative. One of my concerns on the last administration's proposal is that you really didn't get the certainty, particularly as you got away from the major water bodies, and particularly because it relied on the significant nexus test. If you take a look at our proposed Step 2 rulemaking, what we've done is what Justice Kennedy articulated in his concurring opinion, which is absent more specific regulation, he recommended the significant nexus test. We use a significant nexus concept and the science and the policy to drive our proposal, but then our goal is to eliminate that case-by-case specific analysis using factors that are really hard to grapple with and getting more to certainty and clarity. So the answer is yes, I think we can do better providing better certainty, particularly as you get away from the major waters.
Administrator, I've had dozens and dozens of meetings with just regular constituents, not companies, just regular constituents, coming to us and expressing concern or fear over the potential jurisdiction over their property whenever they wanted to do something with it, putting a chill effect on folks doing things like building homes, establishing a small business, and other implications. A lot of the headlines that I've read over the past few months or past few weeks, I guess, have indicated that this is a rollback. Could you talk a little bit about data and justification for just the jurisdictional basis of this?
Well, so the rollback for the 2015 rule, it's about restoring the rule of law. You know, the 2015 rule has been found by several courts to have legal defect and has been actually sent back by a court in Georgia and a court in Texas to the agency to fix it. So, you know, there was an expansion under the Obama rule, and by restoring the 86-88 framework, there's less federal jurisdictional waters. The question and the problem that we have is we don't have the data sets to be able to do a comparative analysis. That has been a failure of the federal government for decades. It's one that we're really focused on. I reject the premise that we can't map it. The people at USGS, the people in ORD, the people over in NOAA, they're fantastic. You just have to give them the right information so they can add a GIS data layer to the NEHD hydrography data set and also the NWI. So we have the ability to do it, but we don't have the data. And to do this comparative analysis, we need to.
I'd certainly love to work with you. I don't see any reason why that would be a partisan effort to get accuracy and clarity. Shifting gears very quickly, I want to flip over to 401. I have met with numerous folks across the country, Washington State, California, New York, and other areas where 401 appears to have become weaponized, meaning that states are using it in a manner, number one, inconsistent with what I believe to be the one-year time frame to make a decision. Is that your belief and understanding as well?
Yeah, the Congress was very clear that it said 1 year means 1 year.
Okay, so secondly, this is part of it's 401 of the Clean Water Act. Watching some of these entirely irrelevant topics that states are using or justification that they're using to refuse to offer the consistency determination is fascinating to me. And in fact, it's actually led to environmental damages, and I'll give you an example. As a result of preventing gas pipelines up in the Northeast, they actually burned home heating oil and imported gas from Vladimir Putin. Russian gas is 13% dirtier emissions than U.S. gas. Home heating oil has extraordinary emissions compared to natural gas as well. So their efforts to protect the environment are actually damaging the environment. Washington State using things that are entirely unrelated to clean water to stop certification. Do you think this is inappropriate?
Time has expired, but the witness may answer the question.
So water, it's a water quality certification. Water quality means water quality. And I'm aware of circumstances where sometimes states lose the forest for the trees.
Thank you. The chair now recognizes Representative Lynch for 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Ross, for your willingness to
testify and help the committee with its work. I represent Boston Harbor. I've done that for about, well, including the state senate for quite a few years, maybe 25 years, and we've spent billions. We've spent billions cleaning up Boston Harbor. And I'm happy to say it's been a dramatic improvement. We see, seals, porpoises, things I never saw when I was growing up there. We see now, since the cleanup of Boston Harbor, the Deer Island sewage treatment facility. So we've made great progress there. Under section, one of the ways that we've been able to do that is using section 401 of the Clean Water Act, which it basically states that a federal agency may not issue a permit or license to conduct any activity that may result in any discharge into navigable waters, Boston Harbor, unless one, a state or an authorized tribe where the discharge originates issues a section 401 water quality certification verifying compliance with the Clean Water Act. So we've used that as a shield to protect Boston Harbor. In August 8, 2019, EPA signed a proposed rule to replace the existing water quality certification regulations under Section 401. Part of that would be to limit the state's ability to protect its waterways. And is that your intention?
No, quite the contrary. We fully support the states doing water quality certifications. And if folks would read the proposal, they still have the ability to take a look at water quality impacts associated with federally issued permits. That's not changing.
So what you're doing, though, is in this rule, proposed rule, which I oppose, it limits the issues that we can cite in refusing a water quality permit. It also limits the time we have to get our evidence together to fight that. And I'm just so. We've never, as a state, we've never relinquished our ability to protect our citizens or our natural resources. We've never done that. There's always been a shared responsibility between the states and the feds. So I'm just worrying if, I'm wondering and worrying, do you think constitutionally you can diminish the rights of the state to protect its citizens or its natural resources?
My touchstone is complying with the rule of law, and I intend to do that. We are following the law and proposing a rule that says 1 year means 1 year. And we're not limiting the ability of states to take into account water quality. I've been to Boston Harbor, and one of the first trips I took in this position was to go up and take a look at our urban waters program. It's fantastic. The 401 modernization effort that we're going through right now, the states will still have the ability to take into consideration of water quality impacts.
Not as much as they can now. Under your rule, it will diminish it. It's pretty plain, the impact of this. So I have a compressor station that they're trying to build adjacent to Boston Harbor, a pipeline, a gas pipeline, that will definitely cause a negative impact on water quality just because of the nature of the discharge and the work they're doing. Under the existing rule, the state of New York has been able to push back under the Clean Water Act and deny licensing to a pipeline, similar to the one that I have in my port. So I'm just worried, I'm very worried that your diminishment of state power under this rule will allow this discharge to go on under your rule, under your new proposed rule that would not have happened when we had the right to protect Boston Harbor. Is that your understanding as well?
If your concern is water quality in Boston Harbor, our rule will not impact the ability of the state to consider water quality impacts associated with that discharge.
Well, you keep saying that, but you're diminishing the shield that we have to protect our navigable waters. In another section here, we have a current restriction on farmers who use pesticides and other fertilizers and nutrients near waterways that are currently prohibited, but you're expanding that ability. I mean, with all the problems we've had down in Florida with algae blooms and other impacts on
tourist areas and beaches, you're allowing that now to happen in a bigger way and restricting states' ability to regulate that as well. I find it stunning, the scope of repeal that you're pushing forward.
Well, I respectfully disagree. So the scope of the repeal on the WOTUS rule was to restore the rule of law because the 2015 rule has been sent back to the agency as in violation of our statutory authority. And under the 401, I keep saying it because it's true. States have the ability to analyze impacts of water quality as part of the certification process.
In a diminished fashion. I thank you for your indulgence, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Lynch. The chair now recognizes Mr. Graves, who's asked to make a clarification on one of his previous questions.
Thank you. Yeah, Mr. Chairman, I believe that Mr. Westerman had deferred some time earlier and claiming that to clarify. In 401, I want to make sure I understand. In the second panel, some of the written testimony indicates that the administration's clarification on 401 would actually hamper states' ability to exercise certification. I guess I struggle with that because is there anything in the administration's clarification that would prohibit states from making decisions based on water quality?
No.
So that testimony would be somewhat confusing or perhaps inaccurate.
Well, I haven't read the testimony, so I won't weigh in on providing an opinion.
Thank you. One clarification, the chairman of the full committee put up a chart earlier on the economic analysis of the WOTUS rule and shared his thoughts of what that chart meant. There was a caveat at the bottom that indicated that that chart represented conditions with no state responses, meaning states would not change laws or do anything differently. Do you believe that to be the case, or do you believe that some states would actually act differently in more dynamic manner?
Well, actually, that's one of the things that we've seen, and we had our economists take a look at, that the whole state's race to the bottom theory has been disproved. States will rise. And so if you take a look at the economic analysis associated with the Step 2 proposal and also what we've done in Step 1, the states will rise, and we've seen it. After the 2001 Swank decision, Wisconsin immediately came in and expanded jurisdiction over wetlands. We have seen it already in response to our proposal. Like the states have already said, we're going to step in and act. So the race to the bottom theory from the 1970s and 80s, I think has been disproved.
And Mr. Chairman, just in closing, I just want to make note that this goes back to my first question, is that I believe the states can tailor the clean water solutions to their own states and own hydrology, as opposed to trying to come in and doing a one-size-fits-all, and I think this is a more elegant solution. I'll yield back. Thank you.
Thank you. The chair now recognizes Mr. Cohen for 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, and for the first time, I can say thank you, Chairman Ruda. Yes. Good to follow Mr. Graves. And I want to thank the subcommittee for honoring my request to hold this hearing today. It's a most important subject, and I was at Judiciary with FISA and then with some eye doctors on the power of stem cells and recreating vision. So you're in good company, but I'm late. It's very important we have the opportunity to examine the impact of coal plants and coal ash dumps on groundwater quality and to examine the effects of coal ash contamination on the quality of drinking water for communities across this country. The issue of coal ash is very personal to my district and myself. The residents of my state have been seeing it in two spots in particular. I've been working alongside my fellow congressman, former fellow Tennessee General Assembly colleague Tim Burchett, a stalwart on this fight, to continue to shine some light on this important issue. 2008, the largest coal ash spill in our nation's history occurred in Tennessee when a dike failed at TVA's Kingston fossil plant, and 5.4 million cubic yards of coal ash cascaded into the Emory and Clinch rivers and smothered about 300 acres of land. I met with TVA officials yesterday. They assured me they're working on the cleanup and looking into the conditions of the workers who claim they've been damaged with health care maladies, and they said this was a preventable accident. And hopefully we won't see it ever again, and they promised me it won't happen again. I think TVA's got good new leadership, and I'm pleased about that. We're here in 2019, and hundreds of people are still dealing with the aftermath of that disaster, though. Meanwhile, the EPA seems to be intent on weakening federal protections for coal ash, and that's disappointing. I would hope that the EPA would work with TVA to see what happened at Kingston and try to see that it doesn't happen again. And in Memphis, they've left a lot of coal ash at a plant, and it's going to be 20 years to rid us of all of it. So that's another area of concern. Mr. Ross, on April 15, the EPA reversed its position for over 40 years and determined that the Clean Water Act does not apply to discharges of pollutions that flow through groundwater before reaching a river, lake, or stream. This action clearly goes against the plain language of the Clean Water Act and creates a glaring loophole which could have disastrous impacts on water quality. The Clean Water Act is vital in preventing even more environmental harm from the disposal of toxic coal ash left at coal power plants across the nation. And that's what we've got in Memphis, is a coal plant now vestigial. There are approximately 1,400 coal ash sites across the country where deadly toxic waste has been disposed of, posing threats to clean water and people's health. And Memphis is one of the finest clean water aquifers in the world, and our folks are concerned about its being contaminated. 92% of coal ash ponds covered by this rule are currently contaminating groundwater at levels exceeding federal health standards. The Allen Fossil plant in my district is identified as one of the most contaminated sites in the country, with levels of contamination hundreds of times higher than what could be considered safe. So, Mr. Ross, my question. For decades, regulation under state laws and other federal statutes, such as the Safe Drinking Water Act and Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, reportedly been shown to be insufficient to protect communities from water pollution. How do you plan to protect these communities, such as Memphis and other Upper East Tennessee, folks in Kingston, living near toxic coal ash sites that are leaching into groundwater and traveling to surface water?
Well, there are multiple mechanisms in play there, whether or not it's the CCR rule, or you have some of our, whether or not state authority under state law. We have other programs at the federal level. But I want to address one of the things that you said about the 40 years of EPA position on the discharges to groundwater. It hasn't been 40 years. We put out a notice early last year trying to decide what is the actual scope of authority under the Clean Water Act for discharges to groundwater. And we got thousands and thousands of comments back. And what we learned is that the EPA originally had a position that it doesn't discharge, we don't regulate discharges to groundwater, because that's exactly what Congress intended. The EPA administrator actually asked Congress up through the debates in the 1972 amendments to ask for authority to regulate groundwater. There were amendments that were proposed to go after and expand the 402 program to extend to discharges of groundwater, and Congress specifically rejected that. And so in the world of statutory interpretation, that's fairly significant guidance to us. And so our position is, we started with what our legal authority is when we wrote that interpretive statement. We didn't follow the Ninth Circuit or the Fourth Circuit. We didn't follow the Sixth Circuit. We figured out what our legal authority really was before deciding what our outcome is.
And when you figured that out, was that less than the circuits had given you authority to do, or more?
Well, so in right now in the Fourth and the Ninth, where there's those courts have taken the position that, and Chair, if I may answer the question, I'm happy to. So rather than, even though I don't necessarily agree legally with the rationale of those courts, we are not upsetting the decisions in the Ninth Circuit and the Fourth Circuit, because we know the Supreme Court has accepted cert and is taking this interesting and difficult question up. And so before EPA goes through rulemaking, for example, we're going to, if we are, have the benefit of Supreme Court guidance, we're certainly going to take that into account. And so we recognize the decisions in the Fourth and the Ninth Circuit, just like we recognize the decisions in the Sixth Circuit.
And that wasn't, I appreciate that, but that wasn't the question I asked. My question was, when you came up with your opinion or your thoughts on what your jurisdiction was, your legal authority, was that more or less than the Fourth, Ninth, and Sixth Circuits allowed you?
It's less.
Time has expired, but allow the witness to answer the question.
It's less. As we explain in our interpretive statement, we have a different position than the Ninth and the Fourth Circuit, and we don't believe we have the legal authority to direct, to apply the 402 program to direct discharges to groundwater.
Mr. Chairman, if I could ask for another minute or two, since I asked for this hearing, and just to get it.
So granted.
Thank you, sir. Firstly, I wish you would go more expansive. It's the people's health that's at stake. It's the water. Water internal, water external, water eternal. That's what we're about. Water creates us. Water makes us live. Water cleans up our lives, allows us to survive. If we have blessed with clean water, we need to keep it. We don't need to find ways to get around enforcing laws that protect water. Water is the most essential element on Earth. I mean, it's there, oxygen, okay. Water, right together, H2O. A. B, we know that coal ash contains toxic chemicals such as mercury, cadmium, and arsenic. The EPA's STEM electric ELG rule was designed to control these and other toxic discharges. Expected to eliminate 1.4 billion pounds of toxic discharges, or 90% of all heavy metals entering the waterways. But the EPA projected 451 to 566 million per year in benefits associated with the rule and a minimal impact on electricity generating capacity prices. Why, despite these numbers, EPA has blocked implementation, is considering revising and weakening these standards?
So the steam electric rule, we are reanalyzing, and we took 2 waste streams out of the 5 or so that were done under the steam electric rule update. We're reanalyzing the information and the data, and we currently have a proposal over at OMB, and so I'm not, at this stage, I'll wait for that proposal to hit the streets, and you'll have your explanation.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. And to close, this was something, I don't know if you're Republican or not, we're all Americans, so it doesn't make any difference if you're Republican, but there are Republicans around because of this administration, and this is one of the good things Richard Nixon did. So please, uphold this for the people's health, and for a little bit that we can think of Richard Nixon in a positive way. I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Mr. Cohen. Mr. Ross, we thank you for your time and for your patience. And the excuse for the rest of the panel, we're calling the second panel up. Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you, Chairwoman. Thank you for inviting me and providing me the opportunity.
You're welcome, sir. We will now proceed to hear from our second panel. Thank you for being here, and all of you are welcome if you'll take your seats. We have Ms. Maya Bellin, Director, Department of Ecology, State of Washington. Ms. Becky Keough, Secretary, Department of Kansas Energy and Environment, State of Arkansas. Mr. Ken Kaposis, Associate Professor, College of Law, American University. And I do think Mr. Delgado would want to introduce Mr. Hickey, who is next from Hoosick Falls, New York. Mr. Delgado, would you want to introduce him?
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. It's a great honor for me to introduce Mr. Michael Hickey, a good friend of mine at this point, and not just a constituent, but a real friend. From Hoosick Falls, as you know, New York, Rensselaer County. We all owe him a debt of gratitude for following a discovery he made after the death of his father in 2013. When Michael's father passed away from cancer, he began to look into connections between cancer and the chemicals used in a local manufacturing facility where his father worked. This would eventually lead to the discovery that there was a higher incidence of illnesses related to PFAS chemicals and extremely unsafe levels of these chemicals in the village of Hoosick Falls, as well as the village of Petersburg's drinking water. But Michael's advocacy did not stop there. He turned the memory of his father into a force for good and nonstop public advocacy.
You want to get Mr.
Since 2013, Michael has been leading the charge to increase transparency and accountability for PFAS chemicals at the local, state, and federal level. And his work led to New York State designating the village as a Superfund site, and the EPA declaring one of the manufacturing facilities in Hoosick Falls as a Superfund site. Michael's groundbreaking advocacy has contributed immensely to our understanding of PFAS contamination in New York, and it is largely due to him that the community has received funding for blood testing, remediation, and is no longer drinking the water that was poisoning them. Michael's a true hero in what he has done to spur action on this issue, and I've been proud to work with him to call for federal regulation on these chemicals, including my bipartisan PFAS Right to Know Act that would add PFAS chemicals to the toxic release inventory. And he joined me at my town hall in his hometown of Hoosick Falls that focused on water contamination in our work to hold those contaminating the water accountable. Additionally, I was honored to have him join me for the State of the Union. Our message then is our message today. The PFAS crisis is urgent, prevalent, and not going away. The administration must step up its efforts to protect the health and safety of communities in upstate New York and across the country. I look forward to hearing Michael's testimony today, and I appreciate the work of this committee to continue to shed light on the prevalence of the toxic PFAS chemical in our communities. I also look forward to continuing my work with Michael, the Hoosick Falls and Petersburg communities, and members of the committee to address the needs of all upstate residents who deserve drinking water that is free of cancer-causing chemicals. And just lastly, I don't often get emotional, Chairwoman, but my exchange with Mr. Ross and his lack of desire to commit to an MCL, and the fact that I was bothered to the degree that I was, in many respects has to do with how connected I feel to Mr. Hickey and the community in Hoosick Falls. This is real lives, real people, not just numbers. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Mr. Delgado. Appreciate it very much. We also have Ms. Pam Nixon, President, People Concerned About Chemical Safety. Mr. Jeffrey Kessler, Senior Attorney, Southern Environmental Law Center. And I would like to reintroduce Ms. Becky Keough for Mr. Westerman to introduce.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and it's an honor today to get to introduce Becky Keough. She is the Secretary of the of Energy and the Environment in the state of Arkansas. That's a recent position as the state has reorganized state government. It's a cabinet-level position. She formerly served as the Director of the Arkansas Department of Environmental Quality. She's had a long career in public service and private service. She's worked for an international environmental and engineering firm. She's worked previously in the ADEQ in the state of Arkansas. And she's also been an active member of the Environmental Council of the States since 1997. And when she became the director of ADEQ in Arkansas, she was immediately elected to one of the four officer positions in ECOS. Maybe the thing I like most about Secretary Keough is that she's a fellow University of Arkansas Razorback alum, College of Engineering. She is a chemical engineer, so she understands these issues very well, and I want to welcome her to the panel today and look forward to her testimony. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Westerman. And we'll proceed with the panel. Ms. Maya Bellin, you have the floor.
Thank you, Chair Napolitano, Ranking Member Westerman, and distinguished members of this subcommittee. My name is Maya Bellin. I'm the director of the Washington State Department of Ecology, and I'm honored and privileged to be here today. Since Congress passed the Clean Water Act over 50 years ago, it has enjoyed ongoing bipartisan support. It has served as the essential framework across the nation for keeping our waters clean and our communities safe, until now. I'm here to speak about deeply troubling circumstances that should alarm Democrats and Republicans alike. And that is EPA's attempt under this administration to dismantle the Clean Water Act. I am gravely concerned that these actions will harm families and communities across the country by putting at risk clean water for drinking, for fishing and swimming, by threatening the economy of our water-based industries, and by ignoring federal obligations to tribal nations across the country, including Washington State's 29 federally recognized tribes. I take seriously my role to provide clean water to 7 million Washingtonians. I must say that I am relieved to see this subcommittee stand up and take notice of EPA's rollbacks. Under the Clean Water Act, Congress empowered states to serve as co-regulators with the federal government. This includes long-standing state authority under Section 401 to ensure that federally permitted projects don't harm our waters. But EPA has now proposed a rule that would, 1, dramatically narrow the scope of projects states can review, 2, severely restrict the time we have to review applications, and 3, grant themselves ultimate veto authority over our state decisions. I cannot stress enough how damaging EPA's proposal will be to states, and this is particularly concerning for Washington, because we are a water state. We are the home to the Puget Sound, one of the nation's largest estuaries. We have hundreds of lakes and thousands of river miles, including the Columbia River. And as a basis for these drastic measures, EPA's proposal actually points to my agency's denial of a water quality certification for the Millennium Coal Export Terminal along the Columbia River. The fact is, that denial was based on the Millennium Project's failure to meet a multitude of specific water quality standards, as well as other state environmental standards. But let's face it, this rule is not about the facts. It is about taking away states' ability to protect clean water. And at the same time the Trump administration is dismantling Section 401, they are also shrinking the pool of water bodies protected under the Waters of the United States rule. They have created chaos by repealing the 2015 WOTUS rule, leaving vast portions of our nation's waters unprotected, contrary to Supreme Court rulings. And in one Washington county alone, the WOTUS repeal will result in the loss of federal protection for over 50% of its streams and its wetlands. And on top of these sweeping rollbacks, EPA is directly targeting Washington State. They just repealed our state's human health water quality standards. These standards apply only to our state and deal with how we protect the health of Washingtonians that consume fish, such as salmon and trout, from our marine and our fresh waters. This combination of rollbacks on both the national and state level is unprecedented. There is no doubt this administration is dead set on overturning protections that have safeguarded our nation's waters for decades. And I am here to say that Americans deserve better. Our children deserve better. We all deserve clean water. But I'm not giving up hope. And that is because of this committee hearing today. And I want you to know that Washington State fully supports Congress's much-needed oversight of EPA and recognizing the dangerous path that this administration is on to ensure that the Clean Water Act is upheld and to ensure that water is protected for all Americans. Thank you for the time.
Sorry. Thank you, Ms. Bellin. Next, I have Becky Keough. You have the floor.
Thank you, Madam Chair and Ranking Member. I am Becky Keough, Secretary of the Arkansas Department of Energy and Environment. I bring greetings from the natural state and from my governor, your former colleague, the Honorable Asa Hutchinson. It is an honor to be here in Washington, D.C. today, appearing before the subcommittee. As our state slogan suggests, in Arkansas, we are incredibly concerned with the health, beauty, and safety of the waters of the United States. In fact, our governor has recently taken extraordinary steps, both financial and regulatory, to ensure the enduring beauty and quality of America's first national river, the beautiful Buffalo, by successfully negotiating a permanent closure and conservation easement conversion of a 6,500-plus hog operation near the river. Our governor noted that he believes in farming, but that it must be balanced with efforts to preserve the buffalo as a national treasure. Finding the balance between progress and preservation is a constant struggle for environmental regulators, legislators, and increasingly now, more often, federal judges. That is one too many cooks in the kitchen, I think we can all agree. When judges are left to be legislators, we have all failed. The recent repeal of the 2015 Clean Water Rule is the first step in making sure we are all using the same cookbook and the same recipe. Prior to the recent repeal, 22 states followed the 2015 rule, while 27 did not. And New Mexico was left unclear as to which cookbook to use, or even if it was able to cook at all. Now, Arkansas was not subject to the 2015 rule, but our bordering states of Tennessee and Oklahoma were. Yet we share similar ingredients. The Mississippi River with Tennessee, creating jurisdictional and adjacent wetland issues, and Oklahoma, where we share numerous interstate waters, some tributaries of which may be currently jurisdictional in Oklahoma, but not in Arkansas. Without a consistent definition of what is and what is not a water of the United States, States are left to whip something up from scratch. Arkansas and Oklahoma, with our Cherokee National Tribal partners, are for the first time ever working together on an Illinois River watershed improvement plan. This basin-wide effort seeks to restore and protect the Illinois River by engaging stakeholders, cities, and industry to address historical issues while ensuring community and agricultural progress continues. A common application of WOTUS will enable bordering states to effectively manage shared water bodies. But it is not only uniformity that we seek. We also want a rule that is lucid, not ludicrous in its application. The 2015 rule had broad opposition because of its, in pot stirrer terms, perhaps unconstitutional reach. The rule made it possible to regulate waters on private land that were invisible to the naked eye with no physical channel or evidence of water flow. With the broad, we will know a regulated water body when we see it reach of the rule. Routine activities such as home construction, farming, and infrastructure investment were stalled as the EPA and Corps functioned as more local zoning boards than federal regulators. Seeking relief from this ambiguity and overreach, we turned up the heat, pushing EPA and the Corps for dramatic overhauls of this rule. We sought respect for the integrity of state regulatory programs through removal of the rule's wasteful federal duplication. We don't always need that second helping. We asked them to serve up a solution that abandoned the helicopter mom mentality in regulatory authorization and decision-making. In Arkansas specifically, we needed a rule that supported critical expansion of our broadband and highway infrastructures. Well, Supreme Court Justice Scalia set out a recipe for success in Rapanos versus United States when he instructed that the Clean Water Act apply only to waterways with relatively permanent surface water connections to navigable waters. And last week, Administrator Wheeler and Assistant Secretary James finalized these efforts to repeal the 2015 regulation, clarifying that water bodies like the Buffalo River are subject to the Clean Water Act, but our backyard puddles are not. By limiting ingredients of the Clean Water Act and spelling out each step of a proper recipe, proposed revisions also curtail states who set out to broadly apply Section 401 of the Clean Water Act, negatively impacting the economies of other states, and perhaps indirect violation of the Commerce Clause. Again, a little bit more pot stirring. The proposals allow the states the flexibility of seasoning a solution, but prevent states with waterways from shutting out neighboring states from entire markets. And while we do not face these same waterway challenges, Arkansas is a net exporter of natural gas and supportive of a protective permitting program that reduces environmental risk while at the same time meets market response and critical use needs. This balance is accomplished in Arkansas through innovation, technology, and best management practices, our secret ingredients. Forestry-led initiatives like streamside management zones, proper logging road construction, prescribed burn academies, and unpaved roads initiatives have contributed to Arkansas's 92% adoption rate of forestry BMPs with resulting water quality protections and wildfire prevention. Well, in closing, I echo the words of Ranking Member, a fellow engineer and a friend to Arkansas, the Honorable Bruce Westerman. In support of a new WOTUS rule and in support of a common cookbook with a workable recipe, he reminds us that rolling back the 2015 rule ends years of uncertainty over where federal jurisdiction begins and ends. For the first time, we are clearly delineating the difference between federally protected and state-protected wetlands. Thank you for your time and consideration.
Thank you, ma'am. We now may proceed with Mr. Kaposis. You're on.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair Napolitano, Ranking Member Westerman, for the invitation today. I am here in a personal capacity. The U.S. has made great strides since our environmental laws were enacted in the late 1960s and early 1970s. But we are only one half of the way to the goals Congress set in 1972 for fishable and swimmable waters, and that goal was to be met by 1983. With much work remaining to improve water quality, the Trump EPA appears determined to roll back water quality protection wherever possible. To date, EPA actions include reducing the scope of waters protected from pollution and destruction under the Clean Water Act to levels not seen since the Clean Water Act was enacted. Just last week, EPA finalized a rule to return the scope of waters protected to those established by the Reagan administration. This is directly contrary to the position of all interest groups following the confusion generated by the Supreme Court, and that point was made quite eloquently by the chairman of this committee. I was on the staff of this committee at that time, and I can tell this committee that no one argued to retain the status quo. Some argued for regulation, some argued for legislation, but nobody asked for the Reagan-era rule, yet that is the course that the Trump EPA is pursuing. Even more detrimental to water quality, EPA is finalizing a rule that, as proposed, would further weaken the Clean Water Act by eliminating protection for thousands of stream miles and wetlands nationwide, including 55 million acres of farmland containing wetlands, an area roughly the size of Nebraska. The proposal was clearly based upon Justice Scalia's plurality opinion in Rapanos, which 5 justices rejected. And notwithstanding what Mr. Roth said about the concurrence of Justice Kennedy called the Scalia opinion unpersuasive and, quote, inconsistent with the Act's text, structure, and purpose, close quote. While there's been a lot of discussion about the proposal providing more clarity, I would argue that it provides far less clarity. If a landowner is supposed to know what is or is not covered on their property, I can read you some of the language that is in the proposal, saying that landowners will have to rely on trapezoidal flumes and pressure transducers for measuring surface flow and comparing that to rainfall, that they will need to do regional regression analysis or hydrologic modeling, that the rule itself admits will be challenging to accomplish in the field and could be time-consuming. That is from the proposal. In developing the Clean Water Rule, EPA's Office of Research and Development prepared an exhaustive synthesis of peer-reviewed science on how waters are connected. EPA has made no attempt to refute the science. Instead, EPA chose to ignore it. EPA ignoring science is like the CIA ignoring intelligence or NOAA ignoring weather forecasts. EPA is reconsidering the steam electric effluent limitations guidelines. These controls would annually eliminate 1.4 billion pounds of arsenic, lead, mercury, cadmium, selenium, chromium, 30% of all toxics discharged by industry in the United States, as well as nutrients from our waters. EPA is doing so even as the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals ordered EPA to consider stronger controls on discharges, not weaker ones. And I would also point out that Mr. Ross earlier, in answer to a question, seemed to not want to answer on the coal combustion residuals rule, known as CCR, not Creedence Clearwater Revival. But that rule is also under reconsideration at this point. So the agency is currently in the process of relaxing the requirements for water discharges while simultaneously reviewing the rule that would have controlled the existing impoundments, the very issue that the Fifth Circuit told EPA to look at. The EPA is allowing greater amounts of pollutants from treatment plants through blending. Make no mistake, this is a reduction in the secondary treatment requirements that Congress wrote into the law in 1972. We've already heard about EPA reversing its positions on Section 401. Ms. Bellin explained very clearly why that is so important to the states. Mr. Ross himself acknowledged that these permits can take 4 to 5 years, yet he would propose to cut off a state's action to act on that permit in year 1, when the state doesn't even know what the project is that it needs to protect its water quality from. The Trump EPA is systematically taking the cops off the beat by significantly reducing its ability to enforce environmental protection laws through budget cuts and reducing the actions it takes. These reductions are a conscious decision to create more avenues for our bedrock environmental laws to be violated without fear of being caught or responsibility. Candidate Trump promised to get rid of EPA in almost every form, leaving, quote, little tidbits intact. This may be in the interest of developers, oil and gas, agribusiness, and significant polluters, such as coal-fired plants, but it's not in the interest of the public or the environment. In my 34 years of water law, I have never heard the public say that the water in our rivers, lakes, and streams and ponds is too clean, that there are too many healthy fish to catch and eat, that our drinking water is too clean, or that we need more beaches to be closed due to pollution. EPA needs to do its job in protecting human health and the environment under the Clean Water Act. This is not a time for retreat. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Kaposis. Thank you for your testimony, and I will proceed with Mr. Hickey.
Thank you very much, Chairwoman. Obviously, public speaking, this isn't really my most favorite place to be doing at all. So I really appreciate the opportunity, and hopefully I won't mess this up too badly. But thank you, Congressman Delgado, for everything that you're doing for our community. For me, I'm kind of an accidental advocate for my community. And, you know, it was really more about a mission for my dad. I was started out as a heartbroken son, and I turned into an advocate because of that. And in Hoosick Falls, we have multiple industrial plants. One is called St. Gobain that use PFOA. It's been in Hoosick Falls since 1955. We once had 11 operating plants that had over 500 employees. Now we're down to 2 with 200. So it's been there, and it's the lifeblood of Hoosick Falls. So my dad was diagnosed with kidney cancer in 2010, the month before my son was born. And he actually had his kidney out the day my son was born. So my dad went into surgery, had his kidney out, and I went upstairs and had my son. So it was a process, pretty difficult at that point in time. You know, and kind of next 2 years went by, he was okay. And the kidney came back in his second kidney in 2012, and he passed away early on in 2013. My dad worked multiple jobs. He worked in the factory 11 to 7, and he drove a school bus during the day. And he was retired for 9 months before he passed away. So working 2 concurrent jobs for 32 years is a lot. And me, my brother, and my sister had great opportunities because of the work that my mom and dad did in the plant. And I'm not an environmentalist, and I probably couldn't have given you the full definition of what's a Democrat or a Republican. You know, and this issue for me has been more common sense, and that's kind of what I've tried to do throughout the process. So in Hoosick Falls, we have only 3,500 people on the public water supply, and PFOA at that point in time wasn't tested because our town was too small. It was only 3,500 people under the UCMR3. You had to have 10,000 or above. And actually how we got to that point was a year after my dad passed away. A teacher passed away, and I did a simple Google search because I knew what was being manufactured in town at that point. And I typed in Teflon and cancer, and I came across the C8 science panel in West Virginia. And I read for the next 4 months, every night, probably 11 till 2, 3 in the morning. Probably the most driven I've ever been about anything ever. And I kept reading because it's a big accusation to blame your local employer about, you know, you contaminated our water, you contaminated the people, you're making people sick. They're the lifeblood, and we're blue collar, so those jobs are extremely important. You know, that's what our community is about, and I'm sure that many of your communities as well. That you're hard workers, you're proud to work, and you want to be able to supply for your family. So, you know, I knew that was a big accusation to make. I went to the mayor, and we didn't test because of our size. So I kept on going. I talked to our local doctor. I said, you know, could there be anything to this, these 6 illnesses that are related in West Virginia? Do you see a lot of them here? And yeah, we did, is what he said. We need to push forward, we need to do something. And then going to the county, to the state, nobody would test. So I found who did the testing in West Virginia. I ordered the kit from Canada, and we did the testing. I took water from my mom's house, my McDonald's, the local dollar store, and sent it back, and it came back at 540 parts per trillion at my house, 460 at my mother's. You know, at that point, we knew we had a problem, and brought that back to the mayor because obviously I wanted to hand him off a folder and be done at that point. It didn't go that way. It took another 1.5 years. I had to get an environmental attorney involved. And I think that's why I'm here today, was to speak about the EPA. They played a large role in stopping the water from being drank in Hoosick Falls under the previous administration. And I've had now the privilege to work with the prior administration and to work with the current. And it's a little night and day at this point in time, to tell you the truth. You know, Mr. Kelly, he was the Superfund. He came to Hoosick Falls. I met him. He was really nice. He gave me his card. He said, call me whenever you need anything, because we have 5 Superfund sites now, 1 federal. He resigned 3 days later, though. So that didn't really work out that great with him. I met Mr. Ross when I came for the State of the Union with Mr. Delgado. And I'm sure that he's doing everything legally that he can in following the laws. But I think that there's common sense that we're missing out on right now. I think that, you know, the EPA has a position to help all of the states. In New York, we have a lot of resources. We have DC and the DOH, and they stepped in. But you still needed the EPA to tell us about chemicals, and they're not doing that. And we need to continue to push forward with common sense. There's 20 years of research on PFAS, or if not more, and we just need to do some common sense legislation. Thank you.
Would you wrap it up? Go ahead.
Oh, I'm sorry. No, if I went over my time, I apologize.
Thank you very much for your very moving testimony, and it was really informative and educational, and hopefully we will continue to take action on that. Thank you very much. Next, we have Ms. Pam Nixon. You may proceed.
Yes. Thank you for allowing me the time to testify today. I am president of a nonprofit organization, People Concerned About Chemical Safety, also known as PCACS. Okay. Also known as PCACS, out of Charleston, West Virginia. We're an affiliate of Environmental Justice Health Alliance, excuse me, for Chemical Policy Reform, also known as EJHA. In January 9th, 2014, there was a major chemical spill into the Elk River from a tank farm located along the Elk River in Charleston, West Virginia. 10,000 gallons of crude MCHM mixed with PPH were released into the river only 1.5 miles upstream of our public drinking water supply intake. Our governor and public officials called for a do not use order. This meant that approximately 300,000 residents in 9 counties could only use our tap water to flush our toilets. Nearly 600 people ended up visiting emergency rooms complaining of symptoms related to the spill, and 13 were hospitalized. Schools and businesses were closed, non-critical surgeries were canceled, and our legislators had to temporarily adjourn. Businesses in the area lost at least $61 million during the first month. The most vulnerable were the low-income residents, the elderly, and the people of color who did not own vehicles. They had the difficulty of trying to get to the temporary water stations, to carry their bottles with them sometimes, and then they had to carry the heavy bottles of water back home to be able to take care of their whole family. When the spill occurred, West Virginia did not have spill prevention regulations for above-ground storage tanks storing hazardous chemicals, and neither did nor does the EPA. After reconvening in 2014, our legislators wrote and passed a comprehensive AST bill, above-ground storage tank bill, which Governor Tomlin signed into law. But within 3 years, those provisions had been amended and weakened twice. Congress passed the Clean Water Act in 1972, which directed the President to issue spill prevention regulations for facilities that stored oil and hazardous substances. President Nixon delegated the responsibility of that section of the Clean Water Act to the EPA. The EPA quickly issued spill prevention regulations for oil. But despite promising a spill prevention rule that covered all AST under their jurisdiction, the EPA never finalized hazardous substance spills laws. In 1982, Congress created a federal program regulating underground storage tanks. That contained petroleum and hazardous chemicals. Between 1984 and 2015, Congress passed 5 actions to improve and strengthen requirements for the underground storage tanks, and even created a trust fund for cleaning up leaks. So 40 years later, in 2015, EJHA and PCACS, my organization, and the Natural Resource Defense Council filed lawsuit against EPA over the failure to issue hazardous substance spill prevention regulations for above-ground storage tanks. In February of 2016, EPA agreed in a consent decree to develop the spill prevention rule, accept comments, and publish the final rule by the summer of 2019. In June of 2018, EPA Administrator Pruitt signed a proposal to take no action by pointing to existing regulations that provide only limited regulatory protections. And on August the 22nd of this year, Administrator Wheeler signed the final Take No Action rule, and it was published in Federal Register on August the 3rd. Residents in many states lack any spill prevention laws, remaining as vulnerable as we were in 2014. Without comprehensive rule, EPA continues to put health and safety of millions of American citizens in danger. The country needs a robust federal AST, or above ground storage tank spill prevention program, to protect our waterways. We need regulations to minimize tank leaks in all ASTs containing oil products and hazardous substances, and to protect our drinking water sources. We need a trust fund to clean up AST leaks and spills. We need regulations that will ensure that the design and construction materials and secondary containment systems meet the established engineering standards. We need leak detection and corrosion systems for above ground storage tank. We need transparent third audits. We need the public to have the right to know and access to information about the hazardous chemicals in above ground storage tanks where they live, work, and play. One more, I'm sorry. We also need robust notification to our public and to public drinking water systems in a timely manner when a spill does occur. If EPA continues to ignore providing rules for above-ground storage tanks, we hope that Congress will step up and again require them to do so.
Thank you very much for your testimony, Ms. Nixon, and it's truly good testimony. Mr. Gisler, you may proceed.
Thank you, Chairwoman Napolitano, and Chairwoman Napolitano, Ranking Member Westerman, members of the subcommittee. I appreciate the opportunity to speak to you today. My name is Jeff Gisler, and I'm an attorney with the Southern Environmental Law Center. I lead our organization's Clean Water program. It's in that capacity that I've worked on a number of issues that are before you today. I've described 5 of those in my testimony, and I've described them as they relate to the Cape Fear River in North Carolina. The Cape Fear is North Carolina's largest river system, and it provides the drinking water for more than 2.1 million people. And it faces many challenges. Those include threats created by this administration by the proposed changes to the 401 certification regulations, by the threat of coal ash pollution, the threat caused by sewage blending, the changes to the Waters of the U.S. definition, and from PFAS contamination. It's those last 2 that I want to talk about today in this opening statement, but I'm happy to answer questions about any of those topics. I want to first talk about the Waters of the U.S. change and the radical proposal put forward by this administration in February of this year. And I think it's best to do that by looking at Fayetteville, North Carolina. It's one of the major cities on the Cape Fear, and it's home to our largest military base in Fort Bragg. The change in the definition of waters of the U.S. will have a significant impact in Fayetteville, North Carolina. It will eliminate protections for more than half of the streams that are in the immediate vicinity of Fayetteville, and in a higher percentage of wetlands. That matters in Fayetteville for 2 reasons. First is that Fayetteville gets its drinking water from the Cape Fear. And so when the streams and wetlands that flow into the Cape Fear are not protected, that drinking water will be dirtier and more contaminated. The second reason is that Fayetteville has survived 2 record-setting floods in the last 3 years from Hurricanes Matthew and Florence. We know that the very streams and wetlands that are threatened by this administration, those that dry up for part of the year, are the ones that have the greatest flood storage capacity. They are the ones that protect our communities and buffer us against storms and flooding. We cannot protect places like Fayetteville if we do not protect streams and wetlands. If we go just downstream from Fayetteville, we run into Chemours' Fayetteville Works facility. For nearly 4 decades, Chemours and its predecessor have dumped Gen X and other PFAS directly into the Cape Fear at levels that are hundreds of times higher than what the state of North Carolina recognizes as a safe level. They've not only done that through their discharge pipe, They've done it through severe contamination of the groundwater under the site. Some samples have shown levels of PFAS at 46 million parts per trillion. The state standard for Gen X, that's for Gen X, and the state standard for Gen X, or the health advisory level, is 140 parts per trillion. That groundwater flows into the Cape Fear and combines with their discharge from their pipe and flows 55 miles downstream, where it's taken into the drinking water supply for more than 200,000 people who live in Pender County, New Hanover County, and Brunswick County, North Carolina. Those people have been drinking highly contaminated groundwater for decades, drinking water for decades, from a plant that is more than 80 miles away. Unfortunately, this administration has not responded to that crisis. The PFAS action plan that has been proposed doesn't include any meaningful action that will help the communities like Wilmington, like those in Pender and Brunswick counties. It does too little and it takes too long. If EPA were serious about addressing this issue, they could take immediate action that would stop PFAS from getting into our waterways and not only focus on how we can clean it up after it's out in our environment. The agency has chosen not to do that. It's also decided that reversing decades of legal interpretation of the Clean Water Act, that it's okay for Chemours and companies like it to pollute our drinking water so long as they pollute the groundwater first and let that flow into our drinking water supplies, that is acceptable under the Clean Water Act. It is not. It is not allowed, and the statute prohibits it. This EPA should as well. The Cape Fear is unique in many ways. This story is not unique. Many of our rivers across the country face these same challenges. And if this administration is successful, these stories will end in disaster. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today, and I welcome your questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your testimony. We have votes called already, but we're going to go ahead with the questioning, and then we'll recess for about half an hour before we go vote. My question to Mr. Kaposis is, you talked a lot about maps. Based on your experience as the former head of EPA's Office of Water under the Obama administration, what challenges are posed by Mr. Ross's desire for maps? Are there other tools that the EPA has today that the agency can use to show the waters where protection is lost by the Trump rule?
Thank you for that question. Yes, the question of developing maps for the Clean Water Act jurisdiction goes as far back as there was legislation before this committee in the 1980s to do that. What we found back then, and that things haven't changed, is that, first of all, developing national maps of jurisdictional waters would be prohibitively expensive. It would also require on-the-ground visits by people to make jurisdictional determinations. Notwithstanding what Mr. Ross said, it's not going to be possible to use satellite images or to use existing data. Most jurisdictional determinations are made by somebody going out onto the property to find out if it's jurisdictional. So that, to make a national map, you would then have to put people on the ground onto people's property who may have no interest in knowing whether there is a jurisdictional water or not, because they're not planning to pollute it or destroy it. They don't need a permit. So you would require a physical intrusion onto property all across the nation, anywhere there might be a water feature subject to the Clean Water Act, even to find out if it's not jurisdictional under the Clean Water Act. And because most people undertake their daily activities without triggering any Clean Water Act responsibility, you would be mapping thousands of miles of streams and millions of acres of wetlands for no particular purpose because nobody plans to do anything with them. Now, if somebody can come up with a way to do maps, I agree, everybody would love it, but the hurdles are immense.
Thank you, Mr. Kaposis. Ms. Bellin, in your testimony, you mentioned the Trump administration is repealing the state of Washington's water quality standards to protect human health from toxics and in fish. Seems to me the state of Washington knows more about protecting the citizens' health than the administration. What legal standing does the Trump administration have to, or by what legal standards can Trump administration repeal the state's previously approved water quality standards? And if there is no legal standard for repealing those standards, surely they are basing their decision on science. What science has the administration presented to repeal the state's water quality standards?
They have no legal standing to repeal Washington State's fish consumption rule, otherwise known as our human health criteria. There are two standards under the Clean Water Act for when EPA can reach into a state, into a previously adopted rule that that state chose based on the circumstances, the waters, the beneficial uses, the population, and in our state, for treaty tribes, to determine that that state rule should be repealed. There's two circumstances that they could have done that. Neither exists at this time. One is that if we ask them to come in and repeal or revise based on a set of circumstances, which we have not, or two, if they determine essentially that the Clean Water Act is not being met. And these are protective standards that are meeting the law and the intent of the Clean Water Act. So it is such a dichotomy for me to sit here today and hear the issue raised about states' rights, and let's revert to states' rights so that we can get states to have a better handle and let them look at these things in terms of their particular view, but then to come in and surgically repeal a rule that's been on the books in our state for 3 years that we spent 10 years adopting and getting on the table to answer and deal with water quality issues by virtue of Washingtonians' fish consumption.
Thank you very much for your answer. Mr. Westerman.
Thank you, Chairwoman Napolitano, and thank you to the witnesses for your testimony. I've got some pictures I would like to show, and we seem to get wrapped around the wheel a lot on regulations and what they mean, but I want to talk about something that's happening in my state that Secretary Keough may or may not be aware of, but what you see here is a photograph of water irrigation system. This is surface water coming right out of the Arkansas River. You can see it's got kind of a brown color to it. It's got quite a few nutrients in it. If you don't know the geography, the Arkansas River flows into the Mississippi River, which goes into the Gulf. So the algal blooms and the things we see in the Gulf, a lot of that are attributed to nutrients flowing downstream. And I wanted to show this because this shows what the private sector is doing, how they're usually way ahead of us. And there's a lot of benefits to a surface water irrigation system like this. Number one, this is in rice country, and if you know, it takes a lot of water to grow rice. And for years, we've pumped water out of the Sparta aquifer to flood those rice fields, also to do other row crop irrigation. That aquifer is depleting, which it's very pure drinking water. A lot of areas rely on that water for drinking. So getting water out of the river versus the Sparta is a good thing. Also, if we could do something to clean this water up, what you see in this picture is the same water, it's just been through this irrigation district. And simply what they do is they use the water over and over. They capture the tailwater off of one crop, they pump it back into the reservoir, they move it down and irrigate another crop. The success story of this is it's also been able to cut the irrigation cost in half for farmers who are in this water irrigation district. It doesn't require Sparta water, and it's obviously removing sediments and nutrients out of the water. And the only water that you're losing through the irrigation loop is a little bit of infiltration and evaporation. So this water would end up back in the Arkansas River flowing downstream. I show this because one problem that is being faced here is that there appears to be considerable opportunities for establishing water quality trading programs around the nation. And my question is, why aren't we seeing more trading occurring currently? If we look at nutrient trading and nutrient offsets, what are the main impediments to establishing a successful water quality trading program? And Secretary Keough, I'll ask you that first, what you see on the state level, and then I'll open it up to the other panelists.
Well, thank you, Congressman. Arkansas is committed and has formed a nutrient trading rulemaking committee now through the Pollution Control and Ecology Commission to advance nutrient trading, as you speak to, understanding that that has true benefits potentially for nutrient management, both to deal with the Arkansas-Oklahoma issue I mentioned in testimony, but also as we look at the Gulf hypoxic zone. So we look forward to those advancing. I think the barriers at this point have been somewhat at the federal level, and I know that this administration has spent and recently reissued a direction to the states on how to implement a watershed management system that could invoke or encompass a trading regime. So we look forward to working with EPA on that. We believe in today's world, our ag community as well as our industry understands that a strong economy for them relies on effective and strong environment. And likewise, we believe that effective, strong environment leadership is benefited by a strong economy. So we look forward to that opportunity to tap into those opportunities.
Does any other panelists have any expertise in this area and would like to make a comment?
If I could, Mr. Westerman, the concept of trading has been around for quite a while. It has met with modest success is how I would characterize it. It's a couple of different reasons, often centering around enforceability, accountability, and responsibility. We have found that in some instances, the agricultural interest is not interested in being part of the regulatory program, even though they may be stepping in to take on a responsibility of reducing nutrient loads. So there needs to be a way to bring people in without them having the fear that they are somehow going to become the regulated entity. And that's been a difficult hurdle for the states and for EPA to overcome. A lot of these trades are based on modeling, and there's some uncertainty. You can measure what comes out of a treatment plant. You can test it and measure it, but you have to model for these kinds of trades that use agricultural lands. And that has not been particularly successful yet either. I think conceptually, it has a lot of promise. I mean, it's very similar to what the AIR program has for cap and trade. I think is what you'll see as TMDLs come online, there will be a financial incentive for those who are regulated point sources to participate with non-regulated, non-point sources in the agricultural sector to reduce the nutrient loadings at a lower cost per unit of reduction. But there has to be some forcing mechanism, and that accountability has to be figured out among the parties. And I really, again, I think it's a good concept, but those are the hurdles that I see.
Thank you, and I'm way over my time, and I think if I'm going to vote, are you going to?
Yes, I'll ask a question.
All right.
You can head out.
We will return.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr.
I retract that last statement.
Thank you. I will yield myself 5 minutes for questioning. I want to just focus, Mr. Hickey, on your testimony. And you came back to common sense. And I think you showed a lot of grace in response to Mr. Ross's testimony. My takeaway from the testimony was that despite the fact that we know, the science has made it clear, that PFAS can cause cancer and can lead to thyroid conditions and autoimmune disorders. Despite this fact, he appeared, and the EPA, at least at this point, seems unwilling to at least just go on the record and say, we will provide an MCL. Not what the MCL will be, but that despite we know what this toxin can do to people, people are losing their lives, we can't even go on record in common sense and use our judgment to say, hey, you know what? Yeah, we'll land at some point on an MCL. And that, to me, I find profoundly frustrating and a disservice to the public. I like, and I know you had to stop your testimony. We can talk about the science, and we could talk about the numbers and the parts per trillion and what that all means. But I think there's nothing more powerful than hearing stories like yours and understanding the impact that it has on communities. and what the community feels in terms of its connection to agencies like the EPA. And you spoke about the night and day reality that you have experienced, and I'd imagine others in your community have experienced on this critical issue. So I just want to give you back the floor. And if you'd like, speak a little bit to what it feels like, what it means for you and the community back in Hoosick Falls to have to engage at this juncture with all the mounting evidence and science, with an agency that seems uncommitted to its mission.
Thank you. You know, me and you have had multiple conversations about this in the past, and you know, in MCL, it really, honestly, seems crazy, right? The number keeps trending lower, but it's a carcinogen we're talking about. So how much water do you want to give your children that causes cancer? You know, it's a crazy question, right? So that we even have to even consider giving our children water that causes cancer. You know, so zero really should be the MCL with these chemicals. There shouldn't be any question about it. And I think right now the debate with PFAS, and you're comparing it much to the tobacco industry at this point. These chemicals versus tobacco, they're similar, right? Cancer, we know they're causing cancer, but the difference is tobacco is a consumer's choice. Water is not. And that's the big difference that we have. And over the 5.5 years that I've been working on this now, I spent a tremendous amount of time, obviously, on it. And I've actually felt guilty at times. Why wasn't I involved in this sooner? Why didn't I get involved earlier? But all the science that keeps evolving, you're having more and more states that are getting involved, and there's more contaminations that are being found. And there's no science that's saying that this is good for us. None of it's evolving into saying that these chemicals are going to be positive in the future. There hasn't even been one, right? So, you know, and the problem is that there's 5,000 of them. So there's always one on the back burner. And we're seeing the smaller chains get through the carbon filtration, and that's going to be a problem. So now it's me as an advocate, I'm questioning, did we do the right thing about PFOA? Should we have had them stop using it? Or should we continue to have them use that because we don't know what we're getting next? At least we have the science on what PFOA was. We don't know what's going to happen, like in the Gen X situation. You know, there's science now that's rolling out, but there's a chemical behind Gen X too. So we have these years and years, and we're going to continue to fall behind with the next chemical. So you're making the deal with the devil, I guess, right? Like you have to choose one or the other, because these products these chemicals are in everything that we use. We're never going to be able to completely eliminate them. We need to figure out how to stop them from getting into the air, getting into the ground. Why are we not talking about the sources that they're coming from? We're talking about pulling them out of the water after they get there. Why are we not concentrating more on how did they get there? It came out of the stacks in Hoosick Falls. We should have stopped it from coming out of the stacks. You know, there's spray booths and painting, right, that you prevent the aerosol that getting out into the air. Why are we not doing that with these chemicals? It's just common sense, I think. We're overcomplicating it, and we're causing more years and years of research that we don't need. It's already there. Right. So it's a frustrating process.
Well, I appreciate you saying all of that, and I think it speaks to the fact that more than anything, the lack of urgency, the lack of prioritization. People can't choose, as you so eloquently put it, to drink water. It is the lifeline. It is essential to our existence. There's no way around that fact. And if there's anything the public should be afforded, is a government that promotes its welfare, that protects its welfare. And we need to draw a line in the sand on some of these matters and not make them partisan. Some things aren't partisan when it comes to life. And so I really appreciate what you said. I appreciate your advocacy, and I encourage you, despite the difficulties that lie ahead, despite the cynicism that can certainly settle in at times, to keep fighting and to know that there are folks here that are in this fight with you. Thank you. I ask unanimous consent that the record of today's hearing remain open until such time as our witnesses have provided answers to any questions that may be submitted to them in writing. No objection. Unanimous consent that the record remain open for 15 days for any additional comments and information submitted by members or witnesses to be included in the record of today's hearing. Without objection, so ordered. I would like to thank our witnesses again for their testimony today. If no other members have anything to add, the committee stands adjourned.